Hey everyone, per your requests, I'm starting Sword of Coming, chapters 551 through 560 of the previous episode. Chen Ping'an arrives in the capital city of Southern Garden Nation. While wandering, he encounters an impoverished scholar who reminds him of his past, and a mysterious wandering merchant named Skinny Lu, who attempts to sell him an imperial seal. Though the merchant's story and items seem suspicious, Chen Ping'an's caution, honed by his journey, prevents him from falling into a potential trap. Chen continues his journey with his companions, Pei Qian and his martial arts disciples. As they travel through the landscape, Chen reflects on the nature of martial arts, the weight of his responsibilities, and the true meaning of reason, in a world filled with chaos. He balances his roles as a martial artist and a burgeoning swordsman, realizing that while he cannot save everyone, he must remain steadfast in his own moral principles. Throughout these trials, he maintains his focus, slowly consolidating his fifth-tier foundation, while preparing for the inevitable challenges that await him on his path to the Sword Qi Great Wall. If possible, you can support me via PayPal, or become a channel member to help me keep this channel running. Thank you. Now let's get back to the story of Sword of Coming audio series. Chen Ping'an and Pei Qian arrived at Wasptail Alley where they met up with Wei Xian and the others. Chen Ping'an didn't come across any item that he especially wanted to purchase in Wasptail Ferry Station. He had only purchased a sagely picture book for Pei Qian. The print quality of this picture book was extremely high, and each character was proper and filled with spirit. Just when Chen Ping'an planned to leave the ferry station, a young man holding an empty wine pot wandered out from the alley. He was tall and burly, and there was a belt around his waist that looked a lot like a rusty chain. Chen Ping'an's eyes narrowed, yet his expression quickly returned to normal. He pretended not to see anything, deciding that it was a better choice to avoid potential trouble. Unexpectedly, however, the burly young man briskly walked over upon catching sight of Chen Ping'an. He pointed at Chen Ping'an, as if he vaguely recognized him from somewhere. However, he couldn't recall the name, so his expression immediately became a little flustered. Interaction with this burly young man was inevitable, so Chen Ping'an could only smile and wave in greeting, using the official dialect of Eastern Treasured Vile Continent as he said, "We crossed paths with each other once at the entrance of the small town. I was inside the small town with the gatekeeper back then while you were standing outside the town gate. Your memory is truly impressive to recognize me after so long." The burly young man nodded with a smile, appearing quite delighted as he replied, "Yes, that's right, it's you. Apart from the gatekeeper, you were the first local I came across. Who would have thought that we would meet again here? You've changed a lot since that time, so I didn't dare to confirm my suspicions in the beginning. Also, you said that my memory is impressive, but I feel like your memory isn't bad either. In fact, it's even better than mine." The burly young man with a small stubble saw the 2 pots of well-water immortal wine in Chen Ping'an's hands, so he continued with a smile, "You got the short end of the stick purchasing this well-water immortal wine. The most authentic well-water immortal wine is made using well water from the 3 oldest wells in this area. The asshole shopkeeper who sold you these 2 pots of wine dug a dozen or so new wells himself. In other words, the flavor of this immortal wine is not authentic. Let's go. I'll bring you over to buy some genuine well-water immortal wine. Otherwise, you would have wasted your trip to Wasptail Ferry Station." After taking a single step, however, the burly young man suddenly chuckled and said, "No, forget about it. The cultivation world is filled with dangers, so it's better for the 2 of us to stay further away from each other." He cupped his fists and farewelled Chen Ping'an, striding away to buy wine from someplace else. He was a straightforward person. Chen Ping'an sighed in his mind. The iron chain that the burly young man was using as a belt was clearly the thick iron chain from Jewel Small World's Iron Lock Well. Back then, before Jewel Small World shattered and collapsed, Chen Ping'an had heard other people mention that the huge fated opportunity at the Iron Lock Well had been obtained by someone. Apart from the treasures belonging to the 5 elements, a myriad of other treasures had been concealed in the tiny Jewel Small World. Among these treasures, 5 or 6 of them had been extremely precious, including the iron chain, Song Jisun's green gourd, the mandrel teapot, and a radiant evil-suppressing mirror. Of these 5 or 6 treasures, the dragon-binding chain from the Iron Lock Well was the most valuable. After all, this chain was a demon-binding chain that had once bound the last true dragon in the world. Thus, one could imagine just how incredible the quality of this chain was. Right now, the burly young man had already refined the dragon-binding chain into his bonded item. Moreover, he was wearing it around in public just like that. Either he was extremely powerful and brave, or he had a very strong backer to deter any ill-intentioned individuals. Of course, it was also possible that both were true at the same time. Back in the small town all those years ago, that was the first time Chen Ping'an had even interacted with people from the outside world. There was Sun-Scorched Mountains Mountain-Moving Ape, Dawn Cloud Mountains Kai Jinjian, Light Breeze Cities Su Clan, and Old Dragon Cities Fu Nanhua. Chen Ping'an had faced one perilous danger after another, and that period of time had been the most difficult in his life. He had felt utter helplessness back then, even more helpless than all those times afterward, including his conflict with the nascent tier Flood Dragon in the Flood Dragon Trench and having to face off against the Ascension tier Du Mao in Old Dragon City. However, just like those heartfelt words that Liu Baixiang had spoken in the small courtyard at that time, everything would change if one came across a flower amid an endless expanse of desolation. It would be a life-changing encounter. Chen Ping'an encountered her, a girl whose smile made him feel like the richest person in the whole wide world. How could he not like her? How could he bear to not cherish and think about her? The last time he had drank wine with Fan Air on the rooftop of the medicine shop in Old Dragon City, Chen Ping'an had said, "The girl I like is the most beautiful girl in the world. And what's even more beautiful is when she pretends she doesn't know I'm looking at her. She just sits there with her face turned to the side and her eyelashes trembling slightly." Fan Air was dumbfounded by Chen Ping'an's words, and he asked, "Chen Ping'an, just how bloody much do you like her?" Chen Ping'an was a bit drunk at the time, so he simply held his sword nurturing gourd and chuckled like a fool. While Chen Ping'an set off to look for some authentic well-water immortal wine, the burly young man decided that he was unwilling to run into the young boy, who hailed from Jewel's small world again, lest he raise any suspicions. With this in mind, he purposely chose another wine shop to go to. An old man with a concealed aura silently appeared and walked over to the burly young man, informing him about some minor matter. The burly young man chuckled in anger and remarked, "Are these people stupid? Are they truly willing to die for money? Go and deliver a message to the person in charge. Tell them to stop being so stupid, unless they want to become an appetizer for other people." He initially wanted to say something else, and he wanted to seize this opportunity to address the terrible culture in Wasptail Ferry Station. However, upon thinking of the many challenges that vagrant cultivators and itinerant cultivators faced in life, he shook his head in helplessness and continued, "And we'll leave it at that. There's no need to explicitly warn them. Everything will be decided by their own fate and choices. One thing though, no one in Wasptail Ferry Station is allowed to provoke the young man I came across just now. In addition, you can borrow this chance to privately help Old Man Liu pay off his debts. Abide by the rules and pay exactly how many lesser heat coins are owed. After you complete this task, find an opportunity to strike some fear into Old Man Liu, and have him quit being such a pathetic gambling addict. In any case, he has enough wealth to live the rest of his life in comfort." "What if Skinny Liu can't help himself and gambles again?" the old man asked in a careful voice. "Then it's his own fault. I can help him once, but I can't help him forever," the burly young man replied. The old man wanted to say something, yet he couldn't help but hesitate. The burly young man shook his head and said, "Even though that imperial seal is genuine, ordinary chi refiners would do well to avoid it altogether. Master has said before that one shouldn't underestimate the remnant fortune of a destroyed empire. That imperial seal pertains to profound fortune and calamity, and the crown prince of Wenjing Nation's imperial Jiang clan is still cultivating in the mountains after all. As for the person who's hellbent on collecting all 17 imperial treasures of Wenjing Nation, he's walking the path of aiding the imperial clan. However, this path is suitable for him but not for us. If a person can't contain their greed and desires regarding this matter, then they'll be of the same ilk as Old Man Liu. In fact, they might even be inferior. As chi refiners, we're already being unreasonable by cultivating to obtain longevity. If we further provoke the heavens, then we'll truly be begging for a swift death." The old man nodded in understanding and left. This elderly subordinate who was living a quiet and concealed life in Wasptail Ferry Station was none other than the Golden Courtier Cultivator, who had immediately noticed Chen Ping'an's impressive aura back then. The burly young man sighed again and again, and only after purchasing a pot of wine and drinking the most authentic and rich well-water immortal wine did his mood finally improve a slight amount. When he was still little, a powerful cultivator passing by the beach had taken a fancy to him, telling his clan that he possessed extremely good aptitude. The powerful cultivator asked to take him in as a disciple, and his parents happily nodded and agreed. This was because the elders in his clan had initially concluded that he was unsuitable for cultivation. As a result, he was regarded as trash by those in the same generation as him, especially those who were relatively mature for their age. He was the laughingstock of the clan. Thankfully, he left at a young age and was brought to Wasptail Ferry Station by his elderly master. He moved into a rundown residence located at the tail end of narrow Wasp Alley. His cultivation base advanced in leaps and bounds, and he also managed to obtain a fair amount of faded opportunities. However, the burly young man had no intention of returning home in splendor, and enjoying the euphoria of finally being able to stand up straight and hold his head up high. He didn't want to return to that lofty clan with incredibly strict rules. Instead, he simply wanted to go back in secret to visit his parents and thank them for raising him. That would be enough for him. However, there was also a big sister from the eldest branch of the clan whom he was also very thankful for. A drop of kindness should be repaid with a spring of goodwill. People in the mountains were very fond of uttering this phrase, yet few people genuinely meant what they said. Thus, regardless of how much his master's heart had ached, he had still insisted on giving away that little creature that he had inadvertently caught, offering it to his big sister as a congratulatory gift for her wedding. It was said that this had caused a huge stir in the clan, and many people found it completely inconceivable. To not owe money and to keep a clear conscience, the burly young man felt was quite good. He started to drink wine. The female shopkeeper of this wine shop was an ordinary-looking woman who was honest and hardworking. She continued the tradition of winemaking that was passed down by her ancestors, and she also watched over the old well where they drew water from. However, she wasn't very good at business, and she somehow managed to keep her wine shop as a small business even though she should have raked in bucketloads of money every day. After all these years, the burly young man had personally watched her grow from a gentle big sister into a young married woman. She sold wine year after year, and she would still flush red with embarrassment and irritation when she came across customers who spoke in a flirtatious manner. However, the first signs of wrinkles had already started to appear near the corners of her eyes. When he saw this, the burly young man felt thankful that he had come across his master. Perhaps he would still look the same as right now when even the shopkeeper's grandchildren became old geezers. Even though Wasptail Ferry Station was an immortal ferry station, there were still a significant number of mortal residents who couldn't escape the cycle of birth, aging, sickness, and death. His master had always told him that these people who started graying at 60 and could rarely reach 70 were the foundation that supported the small handful of cultivators in the mountains. Without them, so-called cultivation would be nothing more than a pagoda built on quicksand. The burly young man didn't think much about this. He was too lazy to ponder on these things. In any case, he liked to go with the flow when it came to cultivation. He wouldn't actively harm others, yet he wouldn't be merciful either if others sought to harm him. Because of this, his master always encouraged him to choose one of the emperors in the 3 neighboring nations to support. There was the Imperial Tang clan of Azure Phoenix Nation, the Imperial Yen clan of Lofty Sky Nation, and the Imperial He clan of Fortune Mountain Nation. After he chose one of the 3 nations to support, he could create an alias and enter the imperial court to temper his Tao heart. That way, his experiences would be like a medicine that treated his internal demons, preventing the need for him to become desperate when he eventually advanced to the nascent tier someday. However, the burly young man kept delaying his decision, not choosing any nation to support. After all, what was so interesting about interacting with rulers and officials all day every day? The Emperor of Azure Phoenix Nation was excessively extravagant, and he cared greatly about his face and liked to compare wealth with immortals from the mountains. The Emperor of Fortune Mountain Nation had strange interests, and his imperial harem included the astonishing beings known as the 5 seductresses. The atmosphere in the imperial court was absolutely filthy. Meanwhile, the Emperor of Lofty Sky Nation possessed wild ambitions and a strong desire to make his nation more prosperous. He was extremely ruthless, and even more calculating than disciples from the school of commercialism. In fact, it was said that the emperor of Lofty Sky Nation had personally authored Money, a medicinal herb, an incredibly popular book that contained the following line. Money, sweet in taste and hot in nature, both a poison and a medicine, it can yield divine results. Money can work miracles and make the world go around. This line lay bare the fundamental thought of the school of commercialism. 1. The burly young man drank a pot of wine before paying his bill. He also filled his wine gourd with a few dozen liters of well-water immortal wine, and tied it to his waist before striding away. In addition to this, he also asked for 2 small pots of fine wine, which he now held in his hand. The shopkeeper didn't find this strange at all. Everyone in Wasptail Ferry Station knew that this burly young man wasn't a simple person, so it was only natural that no one dared to provoke him. After settling down in a residence near the tail end of Narrow Wasp Alley at a very young age, the burly young man never provoked other people either. It was rumored that he was looking after half of Narrow Wasp Alley and collecting rent on behalf of someone else. In any case, those who could afford a residence in Narrow Wasp Alley were either wealthy cultivators or pretentious nobles and officials from the 3 nations. The remaining people who owned residences in Narrow Wasp Alley were all local forces. When it came to this latter group, they harbored a deep respect for the burly young man whom they had watched grow up. The burly young man returned to Narrow Wasp Alley, slowly walking toward its tail end. In the middle section of the alley, there were 2 large and vacant residences opposite each other. There were colorful door gods plastered on the gates of the 2 residences, and these door gods still looked brand new even though they hadn't been swapped for several hundred years. One residence was decorated with 2 scholarly door gods, while the other residence was decorated with 2 martial door gods. When the burly young man walked past the 2 residences, he had tossed a wine pot with each hand, causing the 4 colorful door gods to his left and right to immediately glow brightly. Each door god extended a hand to catch a wine pot, then placed the wine pot inside the gates. Afterward, a painted wine pot mysteriously appeared in the paintings of a scholarly door god and a martial door god. After drinking their fill, they passed the wine pots to their companions on the adjacent gates. When they finished drinking, all 4 colorful door gods returned to normal. The paper near one of the bearded martial door god's facial hair appeared a little soggy, but it quickly dried up and left no trace. The burly young man returned to the residence where he lived by himself. The residence appeared very quiet and lonely, and it had already been this way for many years. His master liked to travel around the world, and he always used to announce with confidence that he would definitely bring a breathtakingly beautiful wife back home. This time, however, his master wasn't heading out to look for a wife who potentially wasn't even born yet. Instead, he was heading out to attend to proper matters. His master claimed that he was looking for the colored glazed golden body of some upper 5-tier cultivator who had passed away. A few pieces of this cultivator's colored glazed golden body had fallen into Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, so he would definitely strike it rich if he could obtain one of these pieces. At that time, he would have enough money to find himself a wife. For the sake of obtaining a piece of the deceased cultivator's colored glazed golden body, his master even asked one of his best friends for help. Otherwise, he might not be powerful enough to compete with the other old bastards. With some assistance from his good friend, however, he would have a much better chance at succeeding. The burly young man felt slightly worried about this. The treasure was profoundly valuable, after all, so would his master's so-called good friend be tempted by it? However, his master had laughed loudly and replied that this was definitely possible with any other person in Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, except for the old geezer who called himself handsome chivalrous young man. Even though this old geezer was stubborn and bad-tempered, he was widely regarded as someone with no guilt in his heart on the path of cultivation. The handsome chivalrous young man had fought with his life on the line 2 times, once to stand up for his friend, and once to defend the honor of his sect. He had advanced to the unpolished Jade tier twice, yet these 2 battles had caused him to fall back to the nascent tier twice. Even Ascension tier elites might not be as gallant and chivalrous as him. That was the first time the burly young man had seen his master speak in such a confident manner, so he finally felt at ease. At the same time, he felt slightly curious about his master's old friend with the peculiar nickname. After buying another 2 pots of well-water immortal wine, Chen Ping'an and the others went to visit the final attraction at Wasptail Ferry Station. This was a 1,000-year-old apricot tree, and its shade covered an area of several thousand square meters. There was a hollow at the bottom of the apricot tree, and it was filled with copper coins, silver, and gold that people had tossed over. The wandering merchant, Skinny Lou, had told Chen Ping'an quite a bit about this ancient tree. There were many interesting stories about this ancient apricot tree. Stories that had existed before Fortune Mountain Nation established itself on the ruins of Wenjing Nation. A long time ago, the founding emperor of Azure Phoenix Nation had made an exception and bestowed this apricot tree with the title of Emperor Tree. Unwilling to be left behind, the emperor of Wenjing Nation had instructed his prime minister to personally visit the tree and purposely bestow it with a title that was 1 rank lower, calling it the Prime Minister Tree. Finally, the emperor of Lofty Sky Nation had also joined in on the fun. Lofty Sky Nation had reached its peak prosperity 300 years ago, and a meritorious general had ridden his horse here and erected a monument and composed an article. Thus, people in Lofty Sky Nation were still accustomed to calling this ancient apricot tree General Apricot Tree, Emperor Tree, Prime Minister Tree, and General Apricot Tree. This was an ancient apricot tree with 3 titles bestowed by 3 emperors. This was indeed a peculiar and interesting tale. Standing in the shade of the ancient apricot tree, Pei Qian took out the small scented sachet that Aunt Gui had given her. Apart from a few verdant green osmanthus leaves, there had initially been a small osmanthus branch as long as Pei Qian's finger as well. The branch was filled with osmanthus flowers, and its fragrance hadn't reduced a single bit even though the branch had been snapped off the osmanthus tree quite a while ago. The golden osmanthus flowers didn't wilt and fall from the branch either. The osmanthus branch and the osmanthus leaves were placed inside Pei Qian's wooden treasure box now, taking up an entire section by themselves. Meanwhile, she used the scented sachet to hold the snowflake coins that Chen Ping'an had given her for New Year. In addition to this, there were also a few copper coins that she had earned through blood, sweat, and tears. For example, Pei Qian had begged Sui Yubian to follow her around when she purchased Spring Festival goods in Old Dragon City. With Sui Yubian being so stunningly beautiful, the shopkeepers had voluntarily dropped their prices without Pei Qian even needing to haggle. 1 copper coin at a time, she had quickly earned 7 or 8 copper coins after purchasing all of the Spring Festival goods. These copper coins were all sitting in her scented sachet now. However, Chen Ping'an had once told her that the scented sachet was no ordinary item, so Pei Qian didn't dare to blatantly tie it to her waist. She only dared to place it inside her sleeve most of the time. She was secretly holding the scented sachet in her hands right now, and she thought to herself that it would be great if she could obtain some branches from the ancient apricot tree as well. There weren't many visitors at the ancient apricot tree, because the local residents would only come here to offer money and pray for good luck during the New Year or some other festivals. Meanwhile, most people boarding and disembarking intercontinental ships at Wasptail Ferry Station were merchants from the mountains who always passed through this area. These merchants neither believed in such superstitions, nor were they willing to waste their money. Thus, the only visitors right now were Chen Ping'an and his companions, as well as a few groups of children from the area who were cheerfully playing with their friends. Further in the distance, there were some other children flying paper kites. Indeed, there were a few paper kites trapped on the higher branches of the ancient apricot tree. Chen Ping'an planned to leave after seeing the ancient apricot tree, which had vague wisps of spiritual energy flowing through it. However, he discovered that the little lotus spirit had crawled out from the ground and was poking its head around near the large hollow of the apricot tree, which appeared much like a grand entrance. A small head quickly popped out from the pile of money and looked at the little lotus spirit. The little creature crawled out from the mountain of money and stood up straight, placing its hands on its hips and putting on a proud and haughty expression. However, it couldn't conceal the curiosity and excitement in its eyes no matter what. The little creature's outfit was extravagant yet comical. It was dressed in a miniature yellow dragon robe, and there was an ivory ritual baton as well as a rosewood saber hanging by its hips. Pei Qian tugged Chen Ping'an's sleeve, and Chen Ping'an thought for a moment before taking out a snowflake coin and handing it to the skinny little girl. He smiled and said, "Go ahead, but remember to be polite when you speak with the little apricot immortal. Don't be disrespectful." Pei Qian immediately ran over and squatted down beside the grand entrance. About 15 minutes later, Pei Qian returned with a skip and a hop, having just enjoyed a bountiful yield. Chun Ping'an didn't know whether to laugh or to cry. He didn't say a word, and he immediately rewarded Pei Qian with a flick to the forehead. However, the little lotus spirit surprisingly sided with Pei Qian this time, making some unintelligible sounds as it waved its arms around. Pei Qian felt slightly guilty, so she obediently turned around and was just about to return the small pile of soil as well as that tender sapling to the apricot tree spirit. It was a pity that she had spent 2 snowflake coins to purchase this. She was definitely going to be on the losing end of this transaction. The little lotus spirit was relatively simple-minded, and it didn't even know how to speak. On the other hand, the apricot tree spirit dressed in extravagant clothes was far more intelligent, with its fluency in the official dialect of Eastern Treasured Vile Continent even better than Pei Qian's. The apricot tree spirit had chattered with the little lotus spirit for a long time, and Pei Qian hadn't understood a single bit of their conversation at the time. Afterward, the little lotus spirit had used its hand to tap Pei Qian's shoe, pointing at the snowflake coin in her hand after it caught her attention. After a bit of back and forth, Pei Qian had started to haggle with the apricot tree spirit. She had also taken this opportunity to boast, saying that the spiritual energy in her home was countless times more abundant than the spiritual energy here. In fact, the spiritual energy at her home was almost as viscous as water. Just taking a single sip would be enough to make one full. In the end, the silly little apricot tree spirit had hesitantly summoned a small sapling in the soil in front of Pei Qian. It said that Pei Qian could take this home and find a place to plant it, and that she definitely couldn't treat it badly. She had to nurture it with spiritual energy that was as viscous as water every day. Pei Qian had patted her chest loudly and agreed to its request. In reality, however, she had already been readying herself for many flicks to the forehead. After understanding the situation, Chun Ping'an accepted the soil and sapling from Pei Qian before walking over to the root of the ancient apricot tree and squatting down. The little apricot tree spirit looked extremely alert and wary as it stood inside the large pile of money. Chun Ping'an finally learned the truth after asking a series of questions. As it turned out, the little apricot tree spirit was soon going to advance to the middle 5 tiers. However, there wasn't enough spiritual energy in this area. Or to be more precise, it didn't dare to absorb too much spiritual energy at all. After all, this was an immortal fairy station where a large number of chi refiners gathered, and the little apricot tree spirit was only able to take root and cultivate here thanks to the 3 titles it had been bestowed through questionable means. In reality, the imperial courts of the 3 nations didn't care too much about this ancient apricot tree. Moreover, the apricot tree spirit needed to consider the forces that owned this immortal fairy station, especially since a decline in spiritual energy was one of the biggest worries of immortal clans and sects from the mountains. For example, Du Mao had forcefully used all of the spiritual energy contained inside Parasol Tree's small world. Even though he had done so for personal gain more than anything else, attempting to advance to the Ascension tier, his actions weren't without benefit for Parasol Leaf Sect. If Du Mao had successfully advanced to the Ascension tier, then according to the rules established by the etiquette sage in Majestic World, Parasol Leaf Sect would have been accompanied by virtue and have its title of sect be protected by the Confucian schools and academies for at least another 1,000 years. One couldn't deny the fact that this was an important factor behind Du Mao's choice to take a risk and attempt to advance to the Ascension tier. Otherwise, he could have simply remained hidden inside Parasol Tree's small world. So you could shatter the formation of mountains and rivers, yet he definitely couldn't shatter the restrictions protecting Parasol Tree's small world. After Du Mao failed to ascend, however, almost all of the disciples in Parasol Leaf Sect went from sincerely respecting and adoring him to utterly detesting and being furious with him. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that their fury toward Du Mao was etched in their souls at this point, with all of them viewing him as an eternal sinner of Parasol Leaf Sect. An ancestor that rejuvenated the sect? What complete bullshit. He was a sect-destroying bastard who flagrantly wasted away all of the wealth accumulated by his predecessors. As for Du Mao's secondary intention of ascending into that larger cage to forge a path forward for Parasol Leaf Sect, very few people considered this matter. Meanwhile, the sect leader of Parasol Leaf Sect, the sword cultivator dressed in purple robes, and the elderly unpolished jade-tier cultivator responsible for managing the genealogical records in the ancestral hall didn't actively suppress or placate the outrage sweeping through the sect for whatever reason. Those belonging to Du Mao's lineage like his grandson Du Yan not only lost the protection of a nascent tier cultivator, but they were even interrogated by the sect. The Du clan was turned upside down, and all of their wealth was confiscated and handed over to the sect to cover some of the losses. People were treating things in a black and white manner. They were converging near the two extremes of the ruler. However, it appeared as if this was the natural reaction of most people, especially when the matter pertained to tangible benefits that affected them. Qian Ping'an hoped that if he truly founded a sect in the future, people wouldn't view him as a flawless paragon of virtue. If an unexpected and insurmountable challenge truly presented itself afterward, then he also hoped that people wouldn't view him as an irredeemable sinner. Even if everyone went their separate ways, he would strive to make it an amicable parting to draw a full stop to their cheerful times together. He would do his best to end things on a good note. Qian Ping'an squatted down and lowered his head to look at the apricot tree spirit, smiling and asking, "Haven't you held any discussions with the esteemed immortals in Wasptail Fairy Station and asked about becoming a guest elder and becoming an ally with the 5 mountains of a nation? I presume that they'll welcome the addition of a middle 5-tier cultivator who can't run away." The little apricot tree spirit plunked down atop the mountain of money, a troubled expression spreading across its face as it replied in a childish voice, "I also want to do this. However, those people who stink of copper coins might trust me, but I don't trust them at all. This is a very complicated location, with Wasptail Fairy Station neighboring Azure Phoenix Nation, Fortune Mountain Nation, and Lofty Sky Nation. There are several forces residing in the Fairy Station as well, and neither force is willing to yield to the other. For the sake of money, these people secretly smash each other's heads and send brain juice flying all over the place all the time. As for making a vow and becoming an ally with the 5 mountains, which nation's 5 mountains do you think I should choose? If I'm stupid enough to pick a nation, won't the 2 other nations hate me to death? In fact, they might secretly send someone over to fell my main body and chop me into firewood. Even though I'm only receiving a dismal amount of offerings right now, going hungry 3 meals out of 4, I can at least push through this and stay alive. Don't ye refiners like you have a saying? It's better to live a wretched life than to experience a good death. Ma'am, and there's also that other saying, it's better to sacrifice someone else than to sacrifice myself. Qian Ping'an pretended that he didn't hear the final sentence. He completely understood the little apricot tree spirit's worries. As a spirit with no one to rely on, the apricot tree spirit needed to form an alliance with other chi refiners if it wanted to advance any further. However, Wasptail Fairy Station was located at the intersection of 3 nations and didn't belong exclusively to any one nation. As a result, this was genuinely a very troublesome matter. Things would have been far easier if a single force ruled over Wasptail Fairy Station. Qian Ping'an wanted to help, yet there was nothing he could do. I heard the tan little girl say that your hometown is a place similar to a blessed land, and that absorbing spiritual energy is akin to a mortal human drinking water. The apricot tree spirit asked with a pitiful expression. Perhaps you can help me and bring this sapling back home? Once it takes root, it can also help you stabilize the spiritual energy of the mountains and rivers near your home. This is a win-win situation that benefits both of us. Disregarding chi refiners from the school of commercialism who care only about money, which ordinary chi refiner from the school of agrarianism and the school of medicine won't view this as a blessing from the heavens. Esteemed immortal, you definitely have to cherish this opportunity. Qian Ping'an placed the soil and tree sapling on the ground before smiling and asking, "Are you also going to say that those who refuse the blessings of the heavens will be punished instead?" The apricot tree spirit hung its head in dejection and scratched its cheeks as it lamented. Those 2 little ones were easy to trick, but this big one is experienced with the cultivation world and much more difficult to trick, just as I expected. If Qian Ping'an planted this small sapling on his mountain, it could indeed help him stabilize the spiritual energy in the area. However, the benefits would be extremely limited, and the small sapling would mostly be focused on absorbing spiritual energy for its ancestral tree. In other words, this was definitely a money-losing deal for Qian Ping'an. Because of the old locust tree in his hometown, Qian Ping'an had learned some secrets regarding tree spirits when having casual chats with Ma Ji, the old sword cultivator and guest elder of the Fan clan, on Osmanthus Island. After Chan Ping'an returned the soil and the tree sapling, the apricot tree spirit was also smart enough to return the 2 snowflake coins to Pei Qian. The little lotus spirit appeared listless and dispirited, and Pei Qian also appeared downcast and ashamed. The 2 little ones both felt like they had failed Chan Ping'an. Chan Ping'an placed the little lotus spirit on his shoulder and reached over to hold Pei Qian's hand, saying with a soft chuckle, "Why are the 2 of you feeling guilty? The apricot tree spirit is the one who should feel guilty." Inside the grand entrance near the bottom of the ancient apricot tree, the apricot tree spirit lay down in a pile of money and yawned, mumbling, "Well, it looks like I can only wait for the next fool to arrive and take the bait." It had a beautiful dream after falling asleep, and it dreamed that it was on a continually growing mountain that soared into the clouds. It grew into a towering tree, and each of its leaves glistened with golden spiritual light, while each of its branches was filled with spiritual essence after being bathed in endless golden incense smoke. It became the only tree spirit to advance to the upper 5 tiers in the entire eastern treasured Vile continent. On one of its highest branches, 2 hazy figures were standing there and gazing at the sea of clouds. One person was drinking wine, and one person had a sword and a saber hanging by her hip. The little apricot tree spirit was delighted after walking up. Even though it was only a dream, this was still enough to make him feel happy for several years. For some unknown reason, however, it discovered that its face was filled with tears. The apricot tree spirit dazedly lay atop the mountain of money, perplexed by what was going on. It couldn't help but feel a sense of emptiness as if it had lost something important. Using the lesser heat coins that were worth 100 snowflake coins each, Chan Ping'an's 4 subordinates all returned with some new purchases. Zhu Lian, for instance, had nothing whatsoever in the beginning. By the time they'd left Old Dragon City, however, he was carrying a bag on his back. And now that they were about to leave Wasptail Ferry Station, the bag on his back had become even heavier. Zhu Lian regarded himself as a scholar now, so he naturally had to travel around with books on his back. Chan Ping'an and the others traveled to the capital of Azure Phoenix Nation on foot. Of the 3 nations surrounding Wasptail Ferry Station, Azure Phoenix Nation had hosted a grand liberation rite of water and land 2 years ago. The Emperor had personally organized the liberation rite. In response to this, both Lofty Sky Nation and Fortune Mountain Nation hosted a heavenly worship ceremony at almost the exact same time last year, as if there were some sort of competition. The 2 ceremonies had attracted almost all of the Taoist cultivators and caught Azure Phoenix Nation by complete surprise. However, the Emperor of Azure Phoenix Nation didn't back down, and he planned to host a debate between Buddhism and Taoism during spring this year. He was going to pick either Buddhism or Taoism to become the national religion of Azure Phoenix Nation. The winner would be placed higher than Confucianism, while the loser would be relegated to last place. Because of this, Chan Ping'an felt like Zhang Shanfeng and Su Yuanxia would remain in the capital of Azure Phoenix Nation until at least the end of spring this year. Most likely due to their close proximity to Wasptail Ferry Station, and the large number of Taoist temples, Buddhist temples, mountains and rivers in their jurisdictions, these 3 nations had sufficient spiritual energy. They were not among the places with such little spiritual energy that they were viewed as Tao-less territories. In fact, there was far more spiritual energy in these 3 nations than Watercombing Nation, where Chan Ping'an had ventured in the past. He had only been a pure martial artist at the time, so he hadn't been able to fully appreciate the situation, only having a rough gauge instead. Now that he had refined the water seal into a bonded item, and was able to slowly absorb spiritual energy, however, he could discover the mystical nature of the situation when comparing the 2 different regions. Of the several nations in the central region of Eastern Treasured Vile Continent that Chan Ping'an had traveled through on foot, it was Colorful Garment Nation that contained slightly more spiritual energy than the other nations. However, Chan Ping'an didn't like her, so he never once allowed her out of the strange talisman that she called home after leaving Osmanthus Island. He would let her out after he returned home to Downtrodden Mountain in the future. There was a mountain god guarding the surrounding mountains and rivers, so Chan Ping'an was confident that the female bone ghost would be deterred from doing anything reckless. Deities from ordinary nations in Eastern Treasured Vile Continent were incomparable to formal mountain gods and river gods from the Great Li Empire. Deities in the Great Li Empire were naturally 1 rank higher than those in other nations. This was the case now, but in the future. Half of Eastern Treasured Vile Continent had been conquered by the Great Li Empire now, and all that was missing was approval from the Confucian school in Middle-earth Divine Continent. Thus, the rank of deities in the Great Li Empire and Middle-earth Divine Continent would most likely be the same in the future. After all, half of the continent would belong to the Great Li Empire. When leaving Wasptail Ferry Station, Qian Ping'an and the others noticed that all travelers entering the Immortal Ferry Station were holding a yellow paper talisman sold at the entrance, whether they were chi refiners or martial artists. After they entered the ferry station, a rippling door would appear for them to walk through. To put things simply, the yellow paper talisman was quite similar to passports and travel documents used by nations in the mortal world. Even so, this was quite novel, and it was the first time Qian Ping'an had seen something. He had never come across another ferry station that required payment to enter. Of course, there was no need for them to purchase the yellow paper talisman since they were leaving the ferry station. After leaving, Qian Ping'an walked over to ask a fifth-tier chi refiner guarding the entrance some questions. Qian Ping'an was very sincere, and the guard also noticed the young boy's impressive aura as well as the fact that he had walked out from the Immortal Ferry Station just then. Thus he smiled and answered Qian Ping'an's questions. As it turned out, there was a formation created by naturalists and mechanists surrounding Wasptail Ferry Station. Earth immortals at the Golden Core tier and above could directly enter, while those below the Golden Core tier would need to purchase an entry talisman that cost 5 snowflake coins each. If someone dared to break in forcefully, they would immediately trigger an alarm and be hunted down by the patrolling guards in Wasptail Ferry Station. As for the yellow paper talisman, this was a branch version of the barrier-shattering talisman that Wasptail Ferry Station had requested immortals from the talismanic branch to specifically create for this formation. When Qian Ping'an asked why no other ferry station needed such a talisman to enter, the guard stomped the ground with an amused smile and asked him whose territory this was. The entrance of the ferry station led toward Azure Phoenix Nation. So Qian Ping'an naturally responded that this was the territory of Azure Phoenix Nation's Imperial Tang clan. He came to a sudden realization before the guard could explain the situation in more detail. He sighed with emotion in his mind, remarking that the Emperor of Azure Phoenix Nation was truly very talented when it came to making money. The capital of Azure Phoenix Nation was 800 or so kilometers from Wasptail Ferry Station, and there were still more than 2 months remaining until the debate between Buddhism and Taoism began in the 6th solar term. Thus there was more than enough time to travel there on foot. Afterward, Qian Ping'an and the others came across many Taoist temples and Buddhist temples of varying sizes as they walked toward the capital of Azure Phoenix Nation. None of them were devout followers of Taoism or Buddhism, so it was usually only Qian Ping'an and Pei Qian who would respectfully offer 3 sticks of incense to the gods and deities when they visited these temples. Wei Xian didn't believe in such things, so he generally wouldn't enter the temples and would instead wait outside the entrance. Zhu Lian also didn't believe these things, but he would still accompany Qian Ping'an and Pei Qian when they entered the temples. Lu Baixiang only entered Buddhist temples to sincerely offer incense to the bodhisattvas, while Sui Yubian only entered Taoist temples to offer incense to the Taoist deities. She was relatively sincere as well. Qian Ping'an had warned Pei Qian that she could offer incense, but she wasn't allowed to carelessly pray for anything. She definitely wasn't allowed to kowtow to every single bodhisattva and deity, and make a wish in front of all of them. However, he had also told Pei Qian that if she genuinely felt a strong urge to make a wish one day, then she should do so sincerely and remember the contents of her wish as well as which temple and which deity she had offered incense and kowtowed to. Once her wish came true, she would need to visit the temple again and thank the relevant deity regardless of how far away she was. Looking at Qian Ping'an's serious expression, Pei Qian had been so frightened that she hadn't dared to make a wish in any of the temples. She only dared to offer incense. Otherwise, she felt like she would definitely die from exhaustion if she were made to hastily travel from Dragon Spring Prefecture to Azure Phoenix Nation once her wish came true. If she didn't die from exhaustion, then she would feel such immense regret as she traveled that she would eventually cry herself to death. And there was one other rule as well. Pei Qian wasn't allowed to borrow money for incense. She had to purchase it with her own money. Fortunately, Qian Ping'an gave Pei Qian a few errands along the way, allowing the skinny little girl to earn a few silver coins. After converting this into copper coins, She had enough money to purchase incense at the temples. Pei Qian didn't feel like Qian Pingyan was being stingy and trying to save a few copper coins. Instead, she was increasingly beginning to feel that Qian Pingyan was far more generous toward her, his first disciple, than he was toward Old Man Wei and the others. This made Pei Qian feel very happy. During the third solar term, when Qian Pingyan and the others were traveling through the wilderness of a small county in Azure Phoenix Nation, they felt the mountains shake and the earth tremor even though they were located more than 50 kilometers away from the epicenter. The plumes of rising dust and smoke in the distance blotted out the heaven and earth. As if it were suffering immense pain, a colossal demon that appeared hazy from the distance reared its head and roared, causing countless forest birds to flap their wings and flee. Qian Pingyan thought for a moment before asking Wei Xian and Sui Yubian to head over to investigate the situation. He asked them to check whether any innocent people were injured by the commotion. Qian Pingyan's injuries were yet to fully recover, and he also had to manage the conflict between the lake of spiritual energy in his acupoint and his breath of true qi. Even though he was at the 5th tier of martial arts, his true strength was only hovering around the 4th tier at this moment. Wei Xian held his Du armor, West Mountain, in his hand, while Sui Yubian carried her sword, Deep Infatuation, on her back. They possessed both offensive and defensive abilities as a duo, so they could cover for each other, even if they came across any danger. It wouldn't be difficult for them to retreat to safety. Qian Pingyan didn't purposely walk faster, and when Sui Yubian and Wei Xian returned, they said that an earth bull had been turning around and adjusting its position over there. However, a large group of vagrant cultivators had somehow managed to find this earth bull, which had remained hidden in this area for hundreds of years, and they wanted to encircle and kill it in order to obtain the natural treasures from its body. However, two nosy people had stepped forward to block them, one being a young Taoist priest who wielded a peachwood sword and one being a saber-wielding man with a big beard. The two parties had failed to reach a consensus, so they had ended up throwing hands instead. The difference in strength between the two parties was quite significant, and the large group of vagrant cultivators were hell-bent on killing the earth bull. Moreover, there was a golden courtier cultivator on their side personally taking charge of the situation. Thus there could only be one possible outcome. Qian Pingyan slapped his sword nurturing gourd and leaped high into the air, striding through the sky on his flying swords after 1st and 15th flew out from the gourd. He appeared much like an immortal riding on the wind and clouds. The four martial artists from the picture scrolls exchanged glances with each other. Holding the hiking pole in her hand, Pei Qian also looked left and right in confusion. What in the world was going on?
Sui Yubian disappeared in a flash.
Julien laughed heartily before also dashing away, exclaiming, "It's time for another fight. How satisfying." Wei Xian carried Pei Qian on his back. Lu Baixiang quietly followed the others. He was slightly puzzled about why Qian Pingyan had let his emotions get the better of him. Perhaps he had friends or acquaintances over there. However, since he hailed from Clay Vase Alley in Jewel Small World, shouldn't Qian Pingyan's friends and acquaintances all be people like the 9th-tier martial artist Zheng Dafeng, the 10th-tier Grandmaster Li Er, Sword Immortal Chao Shi, Heavenly Lord Xie Shi, and so on? Qian Pingyan's hometown was brimming with an unreasonable number of crouching tigers and hidden dragons. Even if a profoundly powerful Ascension-tier immortal suddenly appeared before them one day, Lu Baixiang and his companions from the Lotus Flower-blessed land wouldn't feel too astonished. If a minor character at the middle 5 tiers suddenly appeared and claimed to be Qian Pingyan's friend, however, they would definitely question that statement. Even though Qian Pingyan had the help of his 2 flying swords, he was still carrying wounds from his previous battle, after all. His breath of true qi was also facing some obstacles, so his speed was roughly the same as that of Sui Yubian and the others running on the ground. At a gigantic mountain pass that was filled with countless shards of crushed rock, an earth bull forced to show its true form after suffering severe wounds was lying in a large pool of blood. Standing back to back in front of the severely wounded earth bull were 2 extremely disheveled people, a young Taoist priest and a big bearded martial artist. They were surrounded by more than 20 qi refiners who were circling them like a pack of wolves. Under everyone's watchful gaze, a young boy dressed in white robes arrived from the sky, either riding on the wind or riding on his sword. He appeared as ethereal and transcendent as a true immortal. The young immortal in white quickly descended and hovered to the ground, nimbly taking 5 or 6 steps before walking over to the 2 disheveled people. He smiled and raised both hands at them. Zhang Shanfeng and Su Yuanxia faltered for a moment, unable to believe their eyes. The young Taoist priest even rubbed his eyes in disbelief. After confirming that he wasn't seeing things, a look of delight rippled through Zhang Shanfeng's pure and limpid eyes. Zhang Shanfeng and Su Yuanxia both raised a hand to high-five Chen Ping'an, the young esteemed immortal who had suddenly arrived in front of them. They no longer looked dispirited, and were instead filled with energy. It was an incredible feeling. Looking at Zhang Shanfeng and Su Yuanxia, Chen Ping'an's eyes were even brighter than Pei Qian's eyes, which contained the sun and the moon. He held the hands of his two friends and laughed heartily, saying, "I knew it. In this whole world, only my two friends Zhang Shanfeng and Su Yuanxia would be willing to put so much effort into a thankless task." A qi refiner who looked to be around 30 years old appeared disheveled as he stood on a gigantic rock. He quietly spat out a mouthful of blood. This fight was full of unexpected surprises, so he definitely needed to do some calculations with the others after they killed the Earth Bull. They needed to ask that golden courtier Earth Immortal for more compensation. This surely wouldn't be taking things too far. After all, while the Earth Bull's entire body was a treasure, the most valuable parts such as its golden core, its horns, its tendons, and so on would all be taken by the golden courtier Earth Immortal. Meanwhile, they would only be left with internal organs and some flesh. Not only that, but they now needed to fight 2 more battles as well. If the golden courtier Earth Immortal refused to pay them a few extra lesser heat coins, then he couldn't blame them if they jumped up and down and cursed in anger behind his back. The qi refiner standing on the gigantic rock was called Lu Yangzhen. He was born in the countryside, and his family had been woodsmen for generation after generation. Now, he was a vagrant cultivator with no permanent residence, and he had just cleared his first big hurdle last year, successfully advancing to the abode tier. Even though this was the lowest tier in the middle 5 tiers, becoming an abode tier cultivator was like ascending to the heavens in a single step for vagrant cultivators like Lu Yangzhen. After clearing this hurdle, he could now be employed by immortal clans with proper lineages and inheritances, or he could become a guest elder in the imperial court of a mortal empire, or maybe in an official residence or a noble clan. To put things simply, vagrant cultivators at the abode tier would finally be worth some money. Lu Yangzhen's dream was to enjoy even better fortune than the time when he had discovered the corpse and belongings of a cultivator in some mountain cave. He wanted to obtain a traditional immortal scripture that contained information about some great Tao that could allow him to become an Earth Immortal. Even if he couldn't become a lofty golden courtier Earth Immortal in this lifetime, simply being able to stand near and touch the door threshold to this tier would leave him completely satisfied. Meanwhile, the greatest wish in the depths of Lu Yangzhen's heart, or his wildest wish to be more exact, was that he could encounter a divine fated opportunity someday. He was already 60 years old, but he hoped that he could mysteriously become a sword cultivator with a bonded flying sword. Thus, the rims of his eyes instantly became bright red when he saw the young esteemed immortal in white robes land on the ground, with 2 streaks of red returning to his vermilion wine gourd. Those were flying swords. They were definitely bonded flying swords. Wasn't there a saying in the cultivation world? Old as a 60-year-old qi refiner at the abode tier, yet young as a 100-year-old sword cultivator at the abode tier. Perhaps this esteemed immortal in white was a powerful cultivator, who had practiced a secret technique to regain his youthful appearance? If he was a hidden sword cultivator at the golden core tier, then they would most likely suffer heavy casualties in this meticulously planned mission. Lu Yangzhen quickly calmed down and composed himself after feeling a surge of strong emotions for a moment. The person standing in front of them was a young sword immortal, who had already nurtured a bonded flying sword, and was able to resist the biting astral winds and the currents of murderous aura. Apart from possessing terrifying abilities, such as astonishing destructive power, and a fondness for determining life and death in the blink of an eye, sword cultivators possessed another quality that vagrant cultivators were even more afraid of. Namely, almost all of the sword cultivators in Eastern Treasured Vile Continent were viewed as precious treasures by the immortal forces in the mountains. If anyone dared to injure them, even if it was only a little, they would definitely draw immediate attention from the ancestral hall of their clan. Lu Yangzhen looked around out of the corners of his eyes. Apart from the golden courtier Earth Immortal using an illusion technique and hiding his true appearance, The other vagrant cultivators were reacting in a very similar manner to him. Some of them were even more cowardly and displayed even flimsier convictions, and they had already put away their weapons to express goodwill toward the young sword cultivator, lest this uninvited guest find a weak opponent to target and kill with a single swing of his blade. No one wanted to be killed to serve as a warning to the others. Of course, there were also those who weren't afraid of death. They carefully concealed the burning desire in their eyes, yet Lu Yongjin could see through some of their small gestures that revealed their true thoughts. They wanted to perform an astounding feat and kill the young sword cultivator along with the earth bull. That way, they could become filthy rich in a single night. If worst came to worst, they could simply flee far away from Azure Phoenix Nation forever. Vagrant cultivators like them were rootless duckweed whom immortals from the mountains viewed as wild dogs anyway, so what would it matter where they lived and cultivated? In any case, there was the golden core tier earth immortal to rely on even if the heavens truly did collapse. Thus, Lu Yongjin and the others all subconsciously stole a few glances at the golden core tier earth immortal. This earth immortal's identity and background were unclear, and he had appeared half a year ago to hire him and the other vagrant cultivators. He hadn't said much. He had simply said that a great demon of the ilk of earth bulls was hiding in a shattered dragon vein with a long history. The earth bull had already hidden there for more than 200 years, allowing it to reach a cultivation base equivalent to the Dragon Gate tier for chi refiners. Once it cultivated toward the golden core tier and formed a golden core, it would definitely start twisting and turning and bring calamity to Azure Phoenix Nation, causing a shocking tragedy to occur. Countless people would die in prefectures and counties within a radius of 500 kilometers. Because of this, they definitely had to suppress and kill the earth bull before it managed to form a golden core. They were doing so for the sake of Azure Phoenix Nation. Lu Yongjin had been traveling with two temporary companions who were also vagrant cultivators to search for treasures back then, and they had almost laughed out loud upon hearing the righteous explanation given by the earth immortal. In fact, they would have definitely laughed out loud if they hadn't feared the golden core tier cultivation base of the earth immortal. The reason why Lu Yongjin had formed a temporary alliance with the brother and his younger sister and traveled through Azure Phoenix Nation, the Fortune Mountain Nation, and several other regions together was because the younger sister was an extremely rare earth cultivator. Right now, the older brother and the younger sister were subtly shuffling toward him already. It was largely thanks to Lu Yongjin and the female cultivator that they were able to share some spoils with the golden core tier earth immortal. Lu Yongjin was skilled at formations, allowing him to suppress the commotion caused by the earth bull turning its body. In other words, he could prevent the proper immortal clans from noticing the situation over here, not giving them the chance to snatch the fruit of the vagrant cultivator's hard work in subduing and killing the demonic beast. Meanwhile, the skills of the female cultivator were the most important factor behind the golden core tier earth immortal being willing to hire them. The earth immortal had only determined the approximate location where the earth bull was hiding, yet he had still been unable to pinpoint its specific location. As a result, the female cultivator who had no skills in fighting was given a chance to show her wares. The female cultivator was a woman dressed in bright clothes, and she was a 5th-tier chi refiner whose cultivation aptitude couldn't be regarded as good. She could only be regarded as decent among fellow vagrant cultivators. She had a fairly good impression of Lu Yongjin, and it could be said that they had been relatively open and honest with each other during their time working together for the golden core tier earth immortal. Using her mind's voice, she secretly asked, "These newcomers harbor animosity toward us. They're clearly friends with those two people. What should we do?" Lu Yongjin stroked his chin and replied, "We'll observe the situation and take action accordingly." The woman nodded in understanding. She was definitely the most privileged vagrant cultivator in this mission to subdue and kill the earth bull. After the intense battle began, she was far more relaxed than both her older brother and Lu Yongjin. In fact, it wasn't a stretch to say that she had nothing to do. This was because she was an earth cultivator belonging to a side branch of the School of Naturalists. Her older brother was a burly man who was 8 feet tall, and he wielded a pair of broadaxes and was dressed in a suit of azure armor that was inscribed with numerous talismans. His face was caked in blood, yet these were fortunately from some external wounds. Due to the strings of fate, he had chosen the path of a militarian cultivator. However, he was only a militarian cultivator in form but not in essence. He had obtained a third-rate immortal secret scripture that taught him how to temper his physique and stabilize his soul. Add to that his precious armor, a spirit tool that he had exhausted all of his wealth to buy in his younger days, and he was like a tiger given new wings. He was fairly renowned in the border regions of the Fortune Mountain Nation. However, the true moneymaker wasn't him, a burly man in armor who possessed impressive combat power. Instead, it was his little sister, an earth cultivator. Chi refiners, especially vagrant cultivators with no teachers and no inherited cultivation methods, were very methodical and particular when it came to searching for treasures. Apart from the so-called fated opportunities of the great Tao that they encountered due to luck, they could also search for clues in the local county chronicles as well as study the geomancy maps that were kept secret and guarded by the local officials. In addition, they could also interact and ask questions of the local woodsmen and fishermen, who often ventured into the mountains and rivers. Only by doing so could they find an opportunity to strike it rich. As a result, these vagrant cultivators would need to employ the help of geographical officials and earth cultivators. It was said that the former could clearly observe the appearance of heaven and earth, allowing them to perform astrological divination to tell one's fortunes. Similarly, earth cultivators were especially skilled when it came to finding dragon veins and detecting slight changes in spiritual energy. Earth cultivators possessed incredibly keen senses. After finding the treasures, however, vagrant cultivators also needed to overcome all sorts of challenges and obstacles. Indeed, most natural treasures in the world were tightly guarded by ghosts and spirits. This had always been the most significant and deadly challenge facing vagrant cultivators. Unlike immortal clans and forces in the mountains, itinerant cultivators and vagrant cultivators often traveled alone and fought for treasures and fated opportunities by themselves. Immortal clans and forces could dispatch all of their cultivators once they found a treasure or a fated opportunity, and if this wasn't enough, they could even seek help from other immortal clans or forces that they had good relationships with. Thus, they rarely failed to obtain what they wanted. On the other hand, vagrant cultivators would have no option but to seek help from fellow vagrant cultivators and share the spoils once they determined that they weren't strong enough to obtain the treasures by themselves. Otherwise, it was extremely likely that they would end up empty-handed. However, why didn't they seek help from immortal clans and forces from the mountains? Wouldn't that increase their chances of success? There were two main reasons for this. Firstly, vagrant cultivators would often be left with scraps and leftover treasures, even though they were clearly the first to discover the natural treasures or secret treasure chambers. Secondly, and more tragically, they could potentially be assassinated by cultivators from the immortal clans and forces. Indeed, one had to realize that vagrant cultivators were largely belittled and resented by cultivators from the mountains. They were like lone ghosts among chi refiners, like parasites who consumed the spiritual energy of heaven and earth, and categorized as sinister cultivators who stooped to extremely low levels. Why was the late unpolished jade-tier cultivator from Wasptail Ferry Station regarded so highly among vagrant cultivators from Eastern Treasured Vile Continent? This was because he had once spoken the mind of all vagrant cultivators in the world, exclaiming, "I just want to stand up straight and eat a decent meal." Cultivators who had their names recorded in two places, the ancestral hall of their force and the imperial court near their force, were regarded as official immortals. On the contrary, cultivators who didn't have their names recorded in these two places were regarded as vagrant cultivators or itinerant cultivators. The imperial courts and local governments all disliked vagrant cultivators. These cultivators had unpredictable tempers, were prone to causing trouble, didn't display any loyalty, and often forced them to clean up their huge messes. This was especially the case with vagrant cultivators at the upper 5 tiers, almost all of whom were extremely resolute when it came to killing their enemies. These cultivators were fierce individuals who had forged a path through countless bloodshed, and their tempers would be even more peculiar and unpredictable than ordinary vagrant cultivators. They displayed no sympathy, and they acted with wanton disregard when they traveled through the world. However, it would definitely be an overgeneralization to view all vagrant cultivators as outlaws who trampled on the lives of others. Even so, immortal forces from the mountains, imperial courts of the mortal nations, and reputable forces in the cultivation world all used a broad brush to paint vagrant cultivators as just that, unpredictable people who acted with wanton disregard for human life. After repeating this message day after day and year after year, Vagrant cultivators were now like rats scurrying across the streets, vermin that everyone wanted to beat to death. Vagrant cultivators who were relatively more powerful would all seek a legitimate position with the imperial court of some nation. Otherwise, they would become a so-called guest elder of some force in the mountains, although this would largely be in name only. They would become official immortals, yet they would still carry themselves as vagrant cultivators. Returning the focus to Liu Yongzhen and his two allies, one was a formation cultivator who wasn't skilled in offense, one was an illegitimate militarian cultivator who focused on defense, and one was a powerless earth cultivator with no combat power. Thus, they could be regarded as relatively normal. However, there was another group of 7 or 8 vagrant cultivators who were assessing the situation and secretly observing the young sword cultivator. In fact, there was also a hint of ferocity and cruelty in their eyes as they looked at their opponent. Most of these cultivators were acquainted with each other already, and they were all chi refiners from regions bordering Azure Phoenix Nation. They were most likely taking advantage of the liberation right of water and land and the heavenly worship ceremony to try their luck. They had made significant contributions in the battle against the Earth Bull, and there was a militarian cultivator who engaged in close-quarter combat, a heretical Taoist priest who was skilled at talismans and puppetry, a ghost cultivator who wielded a soul-summoning banner, and a burly man whose bonded item was surprisingly 3 shields, a rattan shield, a bird shield, and a metal talisman shield. The latter was responsible for protecting his companions who weren't able to dodge in time. There was also an old sword cultivator still at the 5th tier for the moment. His flying sword would condense into a tangible weapon after leaving his acupoint, becoming pitch black and growing to approximately 2 feet in length, shrouded in wind and lightning and also radiating with a strong sanguinary aura. However, because he hadn't reached the abode tier and genuinely created an internal abode yet, his spiritual energy was lacking and unable to support his flying sword for too long. Because of this, he would often launch a single strike before summoning his flying sword back to his acupoint, where he would nurture it using spiritual energy from snowflake coins and wait for the next opportunity to strike. In fact, half of the severe wounds on the Earth Bull's body were caused by the flying sword of this old sword cultivator. In any case, the true backbone of this group of vagrant cultivators was an elder dressed in black robes sitting on a giant black fox with 5 tails. The elder turned his head to glance at the golden core tier cultivator hiding in the background, and his message was very clear. This Earth Immortal was the person offering them lesser heat coins to suppress and kill the Earth Bull, and his group of vagrant cultivators had indeed contributed a lot, doing everything that was asked of them. Now that a sword cultivator with unknown strength had run over to cause trouble, it was up to him whether they should retreat or continue to fight. If the latter option was chosen and they had to provoke the young sword cultivator, then the agreed payment of a few lesser heat coins definitely wouldn't be enough. If the former option was chosen and everyone retreated, then the different parties could each go their separate ways since they had already received a deposit. The golden core tier Earth Immortal hovering in midair surprisingly didn't use his mind's voice to communicate with the 20 or so vagrant cultivators. With mountain mist concealing his appearance, the Earth Immortal instead looked at Chen Ping'an and directly asked, "Are you intent on stopping us from obtaining these treasures? If you and your companions are willing to retreat from this mountain pass and not interfere with our plans, then after we defeat this Earth Bull, I can give you 10% of my share of treasures. I'll convert them into snowflake coins and personally hand them to you afterward." After hearing the explanation from Zhang Shanfeng and Su Yuanxia, Chen Ping'an was roughly aware of the situation here already. Even though the Earth Bull collapsed in blood behind Chen Ping'an was indeed a demon, it was an innately gentle type of demon, and the so-called calamity caused by Earth Bull's twisting and turning that people talked about had absolutely nothing to do with it. The Earth Bull had remained hidden in this mountain pass for more than 200 years, and its intention was actually to repair the shattered dragon vein, such that it could use it as a residence in the future. In all these years, the Earth Bull had actually been lying on the mountain pass in its true form, appearing like a mountain range with many cliffs. Moreover, this not really mountain range was filled with lush greenery from the get-go. Genuine cases of Earth Bulls turning their bodies were caused by AO, mole crickets, earthworms, and giant toads that slumbered under the ground. These mountain spirits and water beasts preferred quiet over commotion, and relying on their innate abilities, they liked to link their gigantic bodies with the surrounding mountains to slowly absorb the spiritual energy of the earth. These spirits and beasts were afraid of spring thunder. Once these spirits and beasts advanced to the abode tier of the middle 5 tiers, or when they were about to form a golden core, they would need to absorb an exorbitant amount of spiritual energy. However, because they slumbered underground most of the time and absorbed the fortune of the mountains, their advance in cultivation base would pertain to the fated opportunities of the great Tao, and cause them to unleash their ferocious nature as spirits and beasts. It was because of this that there were stories about earth bulls turning their bodies and Ao turning their backs, events that would bring tragedy to the mortal world. In reality, Zhang Shanfeng and Su Yuanxia had also been asked to participate in the battle against the earth bull in the beginning. However, even though Zhang Shanfeng's cultivation base wasn't especially high, he was incredibly knowledgeable about the origin of many mountain spirits and water beasts. He was well aware of the origin and gentle nature of earth bulls, so he turned down the earth immortals' invitation to suppress and kill the great demon together. The truly troublesome aspect of things was the possibility that the earth bull was at the dragon gate tier, only a step away from forming a golden core. Zhang Shanfeng understood that even clay bodhisattva statues would also have a temper if they were hunted and provoked. Even honest and friendly people would flare up in rage if they were continually targeted. Would a literal demon not be the same? Thus, Zhang Shanfeng was afraid that the earth bull would trigger violent reactions from the earth veins when it reached the brink of death. If that happened, they would truly witness a colossal earth bull turning its body. This would cause earthquakes to tear through an area at least 500 kilometers in radius, and tens of thousands of innocent people in the 2 nearby prefectures could die without knowing why. He hoped that the abode tier cultivator who had tried to recruit them could speak to the mastermind behind this, and ask them to spend some extra silver to recruit a few additional formation cultivators. That way, they could minimize the impact of the earth bull turning its body. At the very least, they could prevent tens of thousands of innocent people from being needlessly killed, injured, or forced to flee. They could view this as an act of spending money to gain virtue. The abode tier cultivator patted his chest and promised that he would definitely deliver this message. Su Yuanxia played dumb and made some small talk with the abode tier cultivator, after which he and Zhang Shanfeng secretly followed him to check on the situation. And when they discovered only a single formation cultivator among the 20 or so working for the Golden Core tier cultivator, they knew that this would definitely result in a huge disaster. After some discussion, Zhang Shanfeng and Su Yuanxia decided to split up to complete 2 different tasks. Su Yuanxia went to the nearest force in the mountains and clearly explained the situation. He didn't wish for the official immortals to block the earth immortal and fall foul of him. He simply wished that they could either put on some pressure or make some preparations to suppress the imminent massive earthquake. Because Zhang Shanfeng had a proper position as a Taoist priest from Complete Reed Continent's branch of Mount Longhu, he went to the government office and met with a local governor, expressing his hope that the Imperial Court of Azure Phoenix Nation could give some importance to this matter. It would be best if the emperor could dispatch a guest elder to oversee the situation. In fact, it would even be fine if Azure Phoenix Nation provided reinforcements to the Earth Immortal as a way of trying to win him over. In any case, the most critical thing would be making haste and setting up several large formations near the hiding place of the Earth Bull. The local governor was a relatively easygoing person, and he agreed to immediately report this matter to the Imperial Court. He would seek help from the Immortal clan in his jurisdiction, and try to deliver the message as quickly as possible using a flying sword. However, the man was extremely pragmatic and shrewd, and he asked Zhang Shanfeng to hand over 2 valuable items. Otherwise, how would he explain things to the emperor and the cultivators from the mountains if this was a false alarm, or if Zhang Shanfeng was simply making things up? Zhang Shanfeng and Su Yuanxia both felt was a reasonable request, so they had handed over the Dao Sword True Martial, as well as a short saber obtained from Colorful Garment Nation. And as a result of their hard work, they were now stuck in a dilemma. They couldn't convince the vagrant cultivators through reason. These people pursued nothing but material benefits, and this was seemingly the most natural reason for them. Just like the Earth Immortal said, the actions of Zhang Shanfeng and Su Yuanxia amounted to nothing more than stopping them from obtaining treasures. In the eyes of vagrant cultivators, this was something that ought to elicit fury from both gods and humans alike. Naturally, they had their own share of reason. They were encircling and killing a demon in this desolate place without so much as a single person. They weren't killing people and stealing goods in the cities. Nor were they using immortal techniques and immortal treasures to harm mortal people. This was no different from how official immortals went about their business. It was a clean and just way to seek wealth. So what the hell did these people want from them? The young Taoist priest with no facial hair and the martial artist with quite a big beard were claiming that the earth bull being attacked would impact the earth veins and trigger an earthquake that affected an area 500 kilometers in radius. But just who in the hell were they? Zhang Shanfeng and Su Yuanxia sneaked over here and personally witnessed the earth bull shaking countless rocks and trees from its back. The earth bull was an extremely gentle great demon, and it initially wanted to flee when facing the 20 or so vagrant cultivators. It battled while fleeing, yet it was still hunted down and severely wounded. Only then did it start to counterattack, leading to a colossal battle between the two sides. In the end, Zhang Shanfeng and Su Yuanxia had no option but to step forward and defend the earth bull. If the earth bull became so severely wounded that it was forced to reveal its true form, which was only as big as a normal bull, then things would truly reach the point of no return, and it would risk its life to unleash its most powerful attack. The demon collapsed in a pool of blood, debated with itself for a while, when it saw the two people not attacking it but risking their lives to help it. Even though it was roughly aware of their intentions, it wasn't that they cared for its well-being, but that they were afraid that it would trigger an earthquake and bring calamity to everything around it. It eventually decided against seeking mutual destruction. It surprisingly remained still, and allowed its vitality to flow away just like that. Chen Ping'an looked at Zhang Shanfeng and Su Yuanxia. The group of vagrant cultivators didn't use their full strength and try to kill the two people, most likely because they were already on the cusp of victory. Zhang Shanfeng had suffered some external wounds, and blood was flowing from his shoulder pierced by the sword cultivator's flying sword. He had applied some medicine, but it barely made a difference. The wound had most likely reached his tendons and bones. He had been struck by a bonded flying sword. After all, a weapon that was far more than just sharp. Standing beside him, Su Yuanxia's big beard was also stained with blood. This caused his beard hairs to clump together in a somewhat comical manner. The golden courtier Earth Immortal relented slightly at this moment. Afraid that Chen Ping'an would agree to the Earth Immortal's proposal, Zhang Shanfeng immediately grabbed his friend's arm and exclaimed in an anxious voice, "We can't agree to that." The Earth Immortal smiled and asked, "The demon has already given up and accepted death, and it's showing no signs of putting up a final struggle. Chivalrous cultivators and you esteemed immortal, why do something unnecessary? Why insist on fighting against us?" Su Yuanxia was too weak to support his own weight, and his expression was extremely dark as he sat down on the ground. He held the hilt of his saber with one hand and stroked his beard with the other. This is indeed the case. However, I can't help but feel a little disgruntled." The big-bearded martial artist turned around to glance at the earth bull before continuing. "I feel like I'm betraying its trust." Zhang Shanfeng heaved a soft sigh. He sheathed his peachwood sword and let go of Chen Ping'an's arm, lamenting in a helpless voice. "But it seems like we have no option but to accept this?" He was lamenting, yet he was also asking a question. Including the Earth Immortal, everyone had indeed noticed Chen Ping'an's four subordinates from the very beginning. They were all pure martial artists with astonishing auras. This was probably the true reason the Earth Immortal and the vagrant cultivators were willing to lower their weapons and discuss things in peace. Chen Ping'an patted Zhang Shanfeng's shoulder and said, "I'll deal with this problem." Zhang Shanfeng faltered for a moment before cracking a grin and chuckling. "The two of us won't complain no matter what you do. We won't make things difficult for you, honestly." Chen Ping'an nodded before turning to the Earth Immortal hovering in the sky and asking with a smile, "I'm a bit curious, which immortal force do you come from? Or which chief military governor's office in Azure Phoenix Nation do you belong to?" Now sitting cross-legged on the ground, Su Yuanxia gave a knowing smile when he heard this. Oh, this young lad Chen Ping'an was far craftier than before. He immediately asked the question on Su Yuanxia's mind. Yet, it seemed like his martial arts cultivation hadn't improved at all. He was still at the 3rd tier. This was quite a pity. However, this was only normal. Only 2 years had passed since they farewelled each other and went their separate ways, so just how old was Chen Ping'an right now? 17? With this in mind, it was already quite impressive for him to have such a solid 3rd-tier cultivation base. He could confidently enjoy the title of martial arts prodigy. The vagrant cultivators surrounded Zhang Shanfeng, Su Yuanxia, and Chen Ping'an like a pack of wolves. Wei Xian, Sui Yubian, Lu Baixiang, and Zhu Lian didn't walk over to stand beside Chen Ping'an. Instead, they stood outside the circle of vagrant cultivators. It was difficult to determine the exact cultivation bases of these four, and by the looks of it, perhaps they wanted to encircle the 20 or so vagrant cultivators. The Earth Immortal smiled and replied, "Who I am has no bearing on whether you accept my offer or not. How many snowflake coins is this Earth Bull worth in your eyes?" Chen Ping'an asked. The Earth Immortal pondered for a moment before earnestly replying, "The market price of this Earth Bull is approximately 20 to 30 lesser heat coins. However, Earth Bulls and their kin are incredibly difficult to find and capture, meaning that demand for them far exceeds supply. The true price of them is closer to double this value. This is quite a fair asking price. In other words, this Earth Bull is worth approximately 5,000 snowflake coins. What do you think? Perhaps you're trying to calculate how much your 10% share will be worth? Perhaps you feel like 10% is too little and an insult to your strength, so you want 20% or even more." Even though the Earth Immortal was smiling as he spoke, every single vagrant cultivator present could hear the menacing edge in his voice. This was a sign that the Earth Immortal was about to throw hands. A vast and formless might radiated from the Earth Immortal, and even the elder dressed in black robes and sitting atop the giant black fox found it slightly difficult to breathe. After forming a golden core, one could borrow power from heaven and earth. Even though you people are being unreasonable, it was indeed my two friends who created this current situation while trying to stop you. In any case, the fortunate thing is that we aren't facing the worst-case scenario right now. The Earth Bull hasn't turned its body and triggered a massive earthquake. That being the case, it's time for us to calm down and have a good discussion. Since you're hellbent on obtaining this Earth Bull, then we'll calculate things based on the market price of 50 lesser heat coins that you mentioned just then. Subtracting the 10% that you offered to me, that leaves 45 lesser heat coins. Here, take it." Under everyone's watchful gazes, the young sword cultivator in white robes forcefully tossed a large handful of lesser heat coins toward the Earth Immortal located very far away. The Earth Immortal frowned and flicked his sleeve, causing the 45 lesser heat coins to slow down and circle around him like a small stream. The lesser heat coins hovered 3 meters away, and he didn't allow them to get any closer. He carefully observed each coin one by one, and he determined that the young sword cultivator hadn't tampered with any of them. They were genuine lesser heat coins. Lu Yongzhen and the other vagrant cultivators were both envious and puzzled. Such kind of business transaction existed in the world? The Earth Immortal didn't accept the lesser heat coins straight away. 45 immortal coins that were equivalent to 4.5 million taels of silver in the mortal world. Disregarding Azure Phoenix Nation, which was renowned for its wealth in the southeastern region of Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, just how much money did the Imperial Court of Fortune Mountain Nation receive in tax each year? These coins amounted to a colossal sum that even an Earth Immortal couldn't view as trivial. He continued to examine the lesser heat coins that were slowly circling around him as he asked, "Dare I ask, young master, where is your immortal hometown?" Chen Ping'an smiled and replied, "I asked you the same question before, but didn't you refuse to answer?" The Earth Immortal smiled faintly and asked, "Then dare I ask, young master, is it out of desperation that you're spending money to purchase this Earth Bull?" "There's no need for you to worry about these things," Senior Chen Ping'an replied. After thinking for a moment, he retrieved another 5 lesser heat coins and tossed them toward the Earth Immortal, saying, "Please distribute these 5 lesser heat coins among the remaining esteemed immortals. Treat this as my apology for taking the Earth Bull even though I've arrived later." The expressions of the vagrant cultivators improved significantly when they heard this. After all, they were getting 5 lesser heat coins for doing nothing. There were 4 alliances of varying sizes among 20 or so cultivators, and the smallest alliance only had 3 people, Lu Yongzhen and the 2 siblings. Meanwhile, the alliance led by the elder in black sitting atop the giant black fox was the strongest, both in terms of number and power. Thus, they could potentially obtain 2 of the 5 lesser heat coins that had essentially fallen from the sky. The Earth Immortal smiled and remarked, "Such impressive wealth and resolve, young master. To give away lesser heat coins as if they were snowflake coins. I must concede my inferiority to you in this regard." After he said this, The greed of the vagrant cultivators immediately became stirred again. The words of the Earth Immortal resonated with them far too strongly. These vagrant cultivators essentially had their heads tied to their waists with the way they fought with their lives on the line. Yet just how many lesser heat coins could they make each year? I've spoken in a friendly manner, and I've also offered some immortal coins in goodwill. So now it's time for us to engage in some proper discussions. Chen Ping'an looked around before continuing in a calm voice. Money doesn't fall from the sky in this world. I do indeed have some lesser heat coins left on me, so if any of you covet them, you can rely on your abilities to try to obtain them. If you can't defeat me, however, then I will kindly ask for your life in exchange. The Earth Immortal immediately put away the 50 lesser heat coins and asked with a smile, "Aren't you afraid that I'll run away and leave you with a mess to clean up? I can't carry this earth bull on my back and wander through the streets, but taking these 50 lesser heat coins with me will be as easy as can be." He looked at Chen Ping'an and continued, "Aren't you afraid that I'll use these 50 lesser heat coins to buy your life? With this back and forth, everyone including me would have earned 2 times the initial amount of money. Why would we not do this?" Chen Ping'an extended a hand and gestured for the Earth Immortal to leave, saying, "Well, sure, please feel free to leave. You can do whatever you want as long as it makes you happy. You've been pissing me off for a while now, so I really beg you to run away or attack. That way I'll have a good excuse to kill you." The Earth Immortal fell silent, as if he was weighing up the pros and cons. Meanwhile, all of the vagrant cultivators were waiting for him to make a decision. At this moment, the severely wounded Earth Bull suddenly looked up at the back of the young sword cultivator in white and asked in the human tongue, "Esteemed Immortal, why are you going to such lengths for me?" Chen Ping'an didn't turn around to face it. He placed a hand on his sword nurturing gourd as he replied softly, "I feel that you're more human-like than many humans. It's that simple. From today onward, I hope that you can continue to cultivate earnestly. That way, the world can gain another kind-hearted cultivator in the future." The Golden Courtier Earth Immortal suddenly smiled and said, "I see, so you are a disciple of legalism. No wonder." Chen Ping'an didn't know how the Earth Immortal had formed such a misunderstanding. The Earth Immortal was probably very familiar with the culture and customs of the Azure Phoenix nation. He smiled with squinted eyes and continued, "Then we should indeed spar with each other." The atmosphere at the mountain pass instantly became very tense. Vagrant cultivators were accustomed to going back on their word and betraying their allies. People die in pursuit of wealth just like how birds die in pursuit of food. Who didn't want to earn an additional 50 lesser heat coins? They would naturally work for clean money, but did that mean they would refrain from fighting for blood money? How did vagrant cultivators obtain official positions in the imperial courts or become guest elders in immortal forces? Most of the time, their stepping stone would be the completion of a dirty task. For example, they would be tasked with assassinating some important official of an enemy nation, or exacting revenge and resolving hostilities between immortal forces, tasks that were unsuitable for the imperial courts and immortal forces to carry out by themselves. The Earth Immortal calmly swept his gaze around as if he were inspecting the battlefield. "Are you aware that tens of thousands of people will be killed or displaced if the Earth Bull chooses to turn its body and manipulate the Earth veins?" asked Chen Ping'an. The Earth Immortal hesitated for a moment before eventually nodding and replying, "I'm naturally aware of this, given my cultivation." Only the formation cultivator, Lu Yongzhen, furrowed his brow upon hearing this. However, he concealed his expression very well. "Then are you able to suppress the earthquake?" Chen Ping'an asked. The Earth Immortal didn't answer this question directly. Instead, he smiled and explained, "This is no simple task. We can either heed the advice of your friends and spend an exorbitant of money to set up numerous formations in the surroundings to stabilize the earth veins and minimize the impact of the earthquake, or we would need a chi refiner to possess a connate immortal treasure, and have them refine this treasure into their bonded item. That way, the immortal treasure can be used to stabilize the mountains and suppress the earth veins." Seeing Chen Ping'an remain silent, the Earth Immortal carefully observed the young man for a moment before saying, "I'm sure we'll meet again someday." The Earth Immortal seemingly abandoned his plan to spar with Chen Ping'an, and he looked at the leaders of the various alliances of vagrant cultivators such as the Elder in Black sitting atop the giant five-tailed black fox, formation cultivator Lu Yongzhen, and so on. He used his mind's voice to tell them the locations to split up the spoils and receive their remaining compensation, after which he flew away on the wind. All of the vagrant cultivators left following the departure of the Golden Courtier Earth Immortal. However, they all left in slightly different directions, and it was clear that the Earth Immortal had given each alliance a different time and location to receive their compensation and share of the spoils. He would meet with the 4 alliances separately, lest they complain not about the value of their reward, but about the inequality of their share. Zhang Shanfeng gently punched Qian Pingyan in the arm and said in amusement, "How impressive! You're using lesser heat coins as if they're snowflake coins." Su Yuanxia had already stood back up a while ago, and he sheathed his saber before running his fingers through his beard to comb his facial hair that was clumped together with blood. "We're safe for the moment, but I'm afraid that the Golden Courtier guy might harbor ill intentions. I believe that he is one of the most powerful individuals in this area. If push comes to shove, we'll have to abandon our initial plan of staying here and waiting for the debate between Buddhism and Taoism. It would be in our best interests to leave as soon as possible. The true martial sword that Qian Pingyan lent me and your short saber. Are we really going to leave them at the chief military governor's office just?" Zhang Shanfeng asked in hesitation. "Gave, not lent," Qian Pingyan corrected him. Even though Su Yuanxia felt pained and reluctant, he still replied with a resolute expression. "It's not like the chief military governor's office is going to grow legs and run away, so we'll eventually have an opportunity to come back and retrieve them. Otherwise, if the chief military governor's office is the true culprit behind everything, then we'll be running right into their trap. The emperor of the Azure Phoenix Nation has always been an unruly person, while the chief military governor is one of his most trusted subjects. As such, we'll run a big risk of being targeted by everyone. Moreover, we won't be able to explain ourselves and prove our innocence, and we'll also have no way of defending against their baseless accusations." Zhang Shanfeng had once been a stubborn person who would only relent after suffering the consequences, or else he wouldn't have abandoned Confucianism and gone to the mountains to become a Taoist priest instead. However, he had matured a lot during his journey south from the northern complete reed continent to the eastern treasured vial continent. He had seen and heard a lot, and he had also faced quite a number of challenges. In any case, he didn't insist on going to the chief military governor's office anymore after hearing Su Yuanxia's explanation. Qian Pingyan pondered for a long time before coming up with a reasonable plan that could allow Zhang Shanfeng and Su Yuanxia to feel at ease and visit the chief military governor's office. At the same time, they wouldn't be dragged into his dangerous and unpredictable situation. "I came across a fated opportunity at a Confucian academy in the Parasol Leaf continent, and I obtained a jade tablet that can be used to save one's life during times of critical danger," Qian Pingyan explained. "Even though the Azure Phoenix Nation is filled with people from all walks of life, meaning that we shouldn't let our guards down, being in possession of this jade tablet is equivalent to being accompanied by a noble scholar from a Confucian academy. Ordinary cultivators at the Golden Courtier and the nascent tier won't really dare to kill people in possession of this jade tablet. In other words, it won't be too difficult for us to retrieve true martial and the short saber. One needed to be sincere when dealing with other people, yet digging oneself into a hole and facing perilous danger as Qian Pingyan had against Du Mao couldn't be regarded as being sincere anymore. Rather, that was called being simple-minded and naive. Pei Qian and the 4 martial artists from the Lotus Flower-blessed land were already walking over. They were all extremely interested in the young Taoist priest and the big-bearded martial artist. They didn't look like people from Qian Pingyan's hometown, but rather like friends that Qian Pingyan had made during his travels. Wei Xian and the others could all tell that the young Taoist priest was only an ordinary qi refiner with a middling cultivation base. Meanwhile, the big-bearded man was a saber-wielding martial artist with a decent 5th-tier cultivation base. And this was it? Pei Qian was secretly observing the two people the entire time, standing beside Qian Pingyan with her hiking pole in hand and the bamboo saber and bamboo sword that Qian Pingyan had made her hanging by her hip. She smiled and said, "Hi, big brother Taoist priest and saber-wielding uncle. I'm Pei Qian, master's opening disciple." Su Yuanxia chortled with hearty laughter. He had gained 1 level of seniority for free. Even though Zhang Shanfeng's shoulder had been pierced by the sword cultivator's bonded flying sword, and his face was still deathly pale even after applying some golden sore medicine on his wound, The corners of his lips curled up into a smile when he saw the skinny little girl who claimed to be Qian Ping'an's opening disciple. He smiled and waved at the little girl, saying, "Hi, Pei Qian. How old are you this year?" Pei Qian smiled widely and replied, "I'm only 7 years old, and that's why I'm so short." Qian Ping'an immediately flicked her on the forehead. Pei Qian wanted to save face, but she ultimately ended up facing the consequences. Her expression immediately became sullen as she said truthfully, "I'm actually 11 years old." Qian Ping'an turned around before squatting down and looking at Su Yuanxia, asking, "You've suffered severe wounds, so what are you going to do?" Su Yuanxia and Zhang Shanfeng also squatted down, with the big bearded martial artist stroking his beard and contemplating for a moment before replying, "Well, let's forget about that sneaky earth immortal and just focus on that sword cultivator riding the giant black fox, and the other vagrant cultivators. They clearly came with ill intentions, and they would have immediately killed this earth bull if we stepped back and relented. In fact, this earth bull will still die if we leave now and abandon it." What you said was very true. Money doesn't fall from the sky, nor is it blown over by the wind. Since we decided to help the earth bull, we may as well help it until the end. We'll let it in its true form for now, and we can find an earth vein for it to hide itself in once it recovers from its wounds. But this means there'll be more weight on your shoulders, Qian Ping'an. Qian Ping'an smiled and replied, "We've only been apart for a short time, yet you're already being this polite with me?" Su Yuanxia roared with laughter. "Being polite doesn't cost me any money." Like a little chick pecking rice, Pei Qian nodded vigorously in agreement. Being polite and speaking words of flattery genuinely didn't cost any money. This big bearded uncle could most likely be regarded as a like-minded person. Compared to Pei Qian, Wei Xian and the others saw more and thought further. Wei Xian, Sui Yubian, Zhu Lian, and Lu Baixiang had never seen Qian Ping'an asking other people for their opinions before. Not only that, but he was heeding the words of the young Taoist priest and the big bearded martial artist in a very natural manner. It didn't seem forced at all. One had to realize that Qian Ping'an had experienced many challenges and battles together with the four of them. In fact, Sui Yubian had even been killed several times. However, Qian Ping'an's decision-making and demeanor radiated a formless sense of strength, toughness, and assertiveness. At the same time, he still treated them with the necessary amount of respect. Even Wei Xian had to concede that he wasn't exaggerating too much when he praised Qian Ping'an as having the potential to become a powerful ruler. If the two of them had risen together during a chaotic age in the lotus flower-blessed land, then it was very likely that he and Qian Ping'an would have become opponents on the battlefield. Qian Ping'an looked at the earth bull and asked, "Can you assume human form?" If I remember correctly, demons that have reached the sea observation tier or the dragon gate tier can assume human form, can't they? I have some alchemical pills used for treating wounds, and they'll be more effective if you ingest them while in human form. Before Qian Ping'an and the others left Old Dragon City, Lady Gui had sent someone over to give them a treasure box made from osmanthus wood. It was not something worth an exorbitant amount, but it was still not something ordinary people could afford. Namely, the treasure box contained 12 vials of alchemical pills, useful for earth immortals. They were the most cost-effective pills for each cultivation tier in the middle 5 tiers. The Dragon Gate tier earth bull that had suffered wounds to its foundation of the Great Tao shook its head in response to Qian Ping'an's question. This earth bull is quite unique compared to ordinary mountain spirits and water beasts, Zhang Shanfeng explained. The purer one's alignment with one of the 5 elements, the more difficult it is for one to assume human form. For example, this earth bull needs to advance to the golden core tier before it can assume human form. Qian Ping'an nodded in realization and replied, "That's okay. We'll try our best to detour around the provincial city when we head over to the chief military governor's office. We'll take the smaller paths through the mountains and the rivers." Zhang Shanfeng smiled and said, "We're quite familiar with these paths since we traveled to many places around the Azure Phoenix Nation and the Fortune Mountain Nation these past 2 years. Qian Ping'an took out an alchemical pill that was suitable for Dragon Gate tier cultivators and told the Earth Bull to ingest it. 15 minutes later, the Earth Bull could already stand back up even though it was a bit of a struggle. Its body was still riddled with wounds, but these wounds no longer prevented it from walking normally. Earth element demons were known for their tough physique and astonishing stamina. After all, And this Dragon Gate tier Earth Bull also revealed to them that it had refined a green glazed mountain and water vase as one of its bonded items. This vase could absorb and accumulate the spiritual energy of heaven and earth. Qian Ping'an immediately understood the Earth Bull's intention, so he directly handed the entire vial of alchemical pills to the Earth Bull. This way, the Earth Bull could place the alchemical pills inside its green glaze vase and slowly absorb the medicinal effects as well as spiritual energy to heal its wounds. The eyes of the yellow Earth Bull were brimming with tears after it stood up, and it gazed at the young man dressed in snow-white robes and asked in a guilt-riddled voice, "How can I repay your noble act, esteemed immortal? I cultivated here for more than 200 years because I was attracted to the dragon vein of this place. I obtained 2 immortal treasures by chance before, but I've already refined these treasures into my bonded items. Other than these, I haven't obtained any natural treasures of heaven and earth. Esteemed immortal, you've saved my life and even repaired my Tao yet." Pei Qian sighed with sorrow. "It's all my fault. We've only just left Old Dragon City, yet I've already become a money loser? I almost lost 2 snowflake coins at Wasptail Ferry Station, and now we're going to suffer a huge loss in this mountain pass." Qian Ping'an smiled and replied, "It's okay. If you're genuinely sincere, then you can visit my hometown in the future when you recover and form a golden core, and when you can travel around the world in human form. The mountains are beautiful and the water is limpid, and spiritual energy also exists in abundance. You're very welcome to visit." Upon hearing Qian Ping'an say this, Su Yuanxia interjected in a meaningful voice, "Why wait until the Earth Bull forms a golden core? It should head to your hometown immediately after it recovers from its wounds, and perhaps it can directly form its golden core there. There's a sage guarding the fortune in your hometown, and there's no need to worry about unexpected disasters being caused by the Earth Bull turning its body either." There was a confused look in the Earth Bull's eyes as if it didn't understand Su Yuanxia's words. Qian Ping'an carefully contemplated whether this suggestion was viable or not. However, Su Yuanxia smiled and continued, "Well, here's no hurry. We'll travel together for a long while, so let's see if we get along with each other first. It won't be too late to make a decision at that time. If things don't fall in place naturally, then we would be better off parting ways with each other and simply leaving a good impression in each other's minds. We'll meet again if we're fated to, and that will definitely be better than staying together and risking conflict. That would be a waste of the good relationship between us." "I agree," Zhang Shanfeng said with a nod. Qian Ping'an naturally had no objections. They left the mountain pass and slowly made their way to the office of this chief military governor that was greatly renowned throughout the Azure Phoenix nation. Qian Ping'an told Zhang Shanfeng and Su Yuanxia about his travels, naturally leaving out the things that were too sensitive. The young Taoist priest and the big-bearded martial artist also told Qian Ping'an stories about their adventures after the 3 of them had parted ways at the Green Beetle shop back then. The Imperial Tang clan of the Azure Phoenix nation had a tradition of bestowing the title of king, but not a kingdom for these kings to rule. Kings and county kings would stay in their residences in the capital. Moreover, they had the right to live in these residences but did not own them. In other words, they would lose their right to live in these residences once they lost their positions as kings. There were 5 chief military governor offices in the Azure Phoenix nation, in the north, south, east, west, and center. These offices held immense power, and they were responsible for transporting grains to the imperial court as well as to the army. At the same time, they controlled the trade of salt and iron and looked after many other important matters. These were all critical areas that pertained to the lifeblood of the empire. Ordinary rulers were apprehensive of high-ranking officials holding too much power and kings and nobles breaking off and gaining absolute rule over their territories. Yet everything had been calm and peaceful in the Azure Phoenix nation for the past several hundred years. The officials and nobles acted appropriately, so much so that everyone else was left scratching their heads. Some of these nobles had territories so far away from the imperial capital and from the eyes of the emperor, so how was not a single one of them harboring wild ambitions? How were they all remaining loyal and willing to die for the imperial Tang clan? In any case, the Azure Phoenix nation was like an otherworldly paradise filled with peace and tranquility. This was especially the case when compared to the central region of the eastern treasured Vile continent, which was bathed in the flames of war. However, these wars also forced several swarms of nobles and scholars to abandon the north and flee to the south. The Azure Phoenix nation, the Fortune Mountain nation, and the Lofty Sky Nation all took in tens of thousands of these people, with the Azure Phoenix Nation taking in the most. Of the 5 chief military governors in the Azure Phoenix Nation, the 4 in the north, south, east, and west had all been promoted to their current positions after meritorious service on the battlefield or in the military. Only the chief military governor in the central region had inherited the position from his ancestors. Indeed, this position had been held by the Wei clan for generation after generation for the past 300 years. The Wei clan only relied on a single direct descendant to carry on the lineage, which made it seem as if they might falter and die out at any moment. However, they refused to kill no matter what, keeping a solid grip on the position of chief military governor for more than 3 centuries. The current chief military governor of the central region of the Azure Phoenix Nation, the one from the Wei clan who had asked Zhang Shanfeng and Su Yuanxia for true martial and the short saber, no longer traveled around for sightseeing and enjoyment after inheriting this position. Instead, he mostly remained in his residence. However, thanks to his achievements and other stories about him from many years ago, he was still quite renowned in the Azure Phoenix Nation and the 2 other nations. Chief Military Governor Wei was skilled at writing Taoist classics, writing in cursive script, annotating Buddhist scriptures, and painting Buddhist statues. He was incredibly skilled at painting Buddhist deities, in fact, so much so that he was called peerless among his contemporaries. Even in the imperial court, it was very difficult to obtain a single painting from Chief Military Governor Wei. The Chief Military Governor also had an impeccable reputation in the literati world, and he was regarded as graceful in demeanor, impressive in manner, and as lofty and otherworldly as pine trees rustling in the wind. He was even more highly regarded among the noble ladies and maidens in the capital, and it was said that a woodsman had once mistaken him for a transcendent immortal when he was out visiting immortals in the mountains with his friends in the past. The woodsman fell to his knees and kowtowed, exclaiming in astonishment that he had come across a paramount immortal. Now that the capital of the Azure Phoenix Nation was hosting a huge debate between Buddhism and Taoism, Chief Military Governor Wei would travel over to oversee the safety of the capital. He was given permission to bring 6,000 elite soldiers north and have them stationed at critical locations throughout the capital. This was a clear reflection of the emperor's trust and reliance on Chief Military Governor Wei. In fact, their relationship was so close that there were even some rumors in the cultivation world claiming that there was more than just an intimate friendship between them. One had to realize that the emperors of the Lofty Sky Nation and the Fortune Mountain Nation would also be attending the grand debate between Buddhism and Taoism, yet neither of the emperors expressed any objections about Chief Military Governor Wei bringing soldiers into the capital. The emperors regarded this as normal, and this was very strange indeed. On this day, a burly young man came over to visit the Chief Military Governor's office. He kept a low profile and didn't alert any outsiders. Chief Military Governor Wei Liang hosted his guest inside the study. Wei Liang was only 30 years old, and he was a very handsome and elegant man. Even though he was an extremely high-ranking official, he was very casual in his interactions with the burly young man, neither appearing politely distant nor being too purposely hospitable. Meanwhile, the burly young man was clearly well acquainted with the chief military governor as well. He didn't sit opposite Wei Liang. Instead, he stood in front of the bookshelf and flipped through several different books. Wei Liang smiled and said, "Zhang Yun, it seems like your clan holds you in very high regard. What with them being willing to hand this task to you? Well, this saves me some work and effort as well. I'll be in the open while you'll be hiding in the shadows. I believe that this debate between Buddhism and Taoism near the tail end of spring won't bring about too many disturbances." The burly young man was none other than the individual who lived near the tail end of Narrow Wasp Alley in Wasp Tail Ferry Station. Perhaps due to the fact that he had left the immortal ferry station, which was a second home to him, Zhang Yun had used an illusion technique to conceal his belt, the iron chain from the iron lockwell that he had refined into a bonded item. This was to avoid drawing any attention from those in the city. Zhang Yun casually flicked through a book that was filled with an extremely large number of annotations. There was a mix of black and red ink, and it was clear that Chief Military Governor Wei Liang had read this book more than once. Zhang Yun turned around and warned, "You shouldn't be too careless, old Wei. Your emperor has made such a huge mess, and the situation is so complicated right now. Apart from me, several other people from my clan might be lying low in the capital and keeping an eye on the situation as well." Moreover, their cultivation bases definitely aren't low. Wei Liang smiled and didn't offer a response. Jiang Yun felt slightly helpless and he remarked, "A small nation like the Azure Phoenix Nation actually dares to host a debate between Buddhism and Taoism? Not only that, but they're purposely making such a huge deal out of it as well. The Imperial Tang clan might not understand the great dangers implied by competition between the three teachings, but are you not aware of these dangers, Old Wei? Why did the Cloud Forest Zhang clan relocate to the eastern treasured Vile continent back then? I purposely traveled through some bustling areas after leaving Wasptail Ferry Station. And not to exaggerate or anything, but the streets are overflowing with qi refiners right now. This is already the case in the outer regions, so it goes without saying that the capital is no different. Are you people genuinely unafraid?" Chief Military Governor Wei Liang placed a wooden case on the table, and an ice-cold radiance instantly filled the room when he opened it. He retrieved a so-called scholarly knife from the wooden case and said with a faint smile, "It's because of your master that you have some sympathy toward vagrant cultivators and itinerant cultivators. However, this isn't the case for me. Before we reach the end of spring, I'll cast several nets to capture all of the vagrant cultivators who have criminal records, whether their crimes were committed in the Azure Phoenix Nation or elsewhere. I'll act within the laws and catch them dead or alive. A single rat dropping can spoil an entire pot of congee, so what about nests upon nests of rats rushing into the capital?" Scholarly knives were ornaments placed on study desks by refined scholars and literati. Even though they were very small, they could still be regarded as the weapon of a noble person. There were close to 10 ancestral scholarly knives placed neatly inside the wooden box on the table in front of Wei Liang, and they were roughly separated into two categories, those that had seen many summers and winters and those only used for cutting fine xian paper. The former type of scholarly knives could just as well be called carving knives, and this was because people could only keep written records on bamboo slips and wooden slips in the ancient past. These were the books, and thus the small knives used for carving them were rightfully called book knives. They were made of iron in the past, and of copper in the even more distant past. Now, however, they were made from various types of precious materials, and largely used for decoration and collection. They were no longer used for their original purpose. Wei Liang was holding a scholarly knife in each hand at this moment. One was made of bamboo, and the characters made by Jinsong Hall were inscribed on its hilt. The other one was made of white jade and decorated with dragon patterns, and it had the characters tempered 100 times by official craftsmen, inscribed. Jiang Yun returned the book in his hand to the bookshelf inside, saying with a complicated expression, "And that's why you plan to kill so many vagrant cultivators in a single go? To commit many crimes is to seek death. It's quite a bit of work for me to deal with those official immortals in the mountains, so the vagrant cultivators can count themselves very lucky that I'm not directly hunting and killing them. Of course, I also have selfish reasons for going to such lengths to do this. However, a good number of fence-sitters have already become eyes and ears for my office, and they'll have their time to make a significant impact later on. See, this is how clean and simple it is to act according to stringent criteria in this world." Wei Liang didn't look up as he spoke, and his gaze remained fixed on the white jade cutting knife. He then used the bamboo cutting knife to gently tap the white jade cutting knife, causing them to emit a crisp sound. He closed his eyes and listened with great joy. Jiang Yun was slightly angry, even though he had a very good personal relationship with Wei Liang, and he asked, "Are you not concerned about whether your criteria are moral or immoral? Immoral criteria are also criteria, aren't they?" Wei Liang countered. He opened his eyes, his expression calm and composed as he changed the topic and continued with a smile, "Let's not talk about these matters that we're destined to disagree on. During my most recent trip out, I came across a fellow disciple of legalism who was incredibly interesting. His friends left 2 items in my office, so you can stay here and wait around for a few more days if you're interested." Chun Ping'an and the others surprisingly found an abandoned bamboo house next to a lake in the mountains. This bamboo house had been abandoned for many years, but they could still vaguely make out its original appearance. One could imagine just how exquisite this bamboo house had been in the past. It had definitely been built by a wealthy person living a secluded life, and this person definitely liked to go fishing. They stopped here to rest, and each person was given a task. Chun Ping'an left to cut 2 stalks of mature bamboo, one long and one short. When he returned, Zhu Lian had already started a campfire. Chen Ping'an walked over and squatted down, using the flames to slowly cure the bamboo. This would increase the strength of the fishing rod and prevent it from being snapped by larger creatures in the lake. Chen Ping'an handed the shorter stalk of bamboo to Pei Qian and instructed her to copy his actions. Inside the bamboo house, Zhu Lian and Su Yuanxiao were exchanging knowledge with each other. They were sitting quite far away from everyone else, and it appeared that Zhu Lian was showing off the so-called immortal book that old man Sun had given him. Of course, it was a book about men and women fighting in bed. Zhang Shanfeng and Lu Baixiang were sitting on the ground and playing Go, and Wei Xian was squatting beside them and waiting to see who would emerge victorious, as he always did. The yellow earth bull was keeping a lookout in the mountain forest near the bamboo house. This place had beautiful mountains and limpid water, and no one else was around at this moment. Thus, Sui Yubian seized this opportunity to leave the bamboo house, taking her boots off on the foundation of the house that looked much like a bamboo raft. Sui Yubian then sat down and placed her jade-like feet into the water, resting deep infatuation across her knees. She placed her hands on the mouth and tip of the scabbard as she gazed into the distance. The air in the mountains was cool and refreshing. After curing the 2 bamboo fishing rods of different lengths, Chen Ping'an swung his rod a few times to see how far it could bend. Pei Qian stood beside him and did the same thing. The master and disciple walked outside the bamboo house, where Chen Ping'an started to tie a fishing line to his rod. Just like before, Pei Qian stood there and copied his actions. However, she didn't do as well with some of the details, so Chen Ping'an helped her redo some of the knots and fishing hook attachments. He then brought her over to the lakeside in the distance, and they started to flip over some rocks to search for small crustaceans to use for bait. These crustaceans looked like mole crickets. There was also the yellowing parasol leaf, the one that held 2 mountain protection formations derived from Peace and Tranquility Mountain and the Planchette Writing Sect. It also held a large amount of grain rain coins that the parasol leaf sect had given him as compensation. Pei Qian was an innately impatient person, and it was only because she was accompanied by Chen Ping'an and had been forced to read and practice handwriting for so long that she was slightly more patient than before. She quietly stared at the surface of the lake, wishing that she could forcefully reel in a large azure fish of more than 50 kilograms in the next moment. Chen Ping'an was mulling over the 4th meditation stance of the mountain shaking guide, the Heaven and Earth stance. This was a very boastful name for a fist stance. The manual thoroughly explained how one should channel their true qi. Combined both movement and stillness, yet the movements required were truly very strange. People practicing this fist stance were required to do so upside down, and there were 3 levels corresponding to this. They needed to perform handstands using their palms, fists, and a single finger on each hand respectively. They then needed to walk in this manner. With regards to the Heaven and Earth stance, there was an extremely bold description in the Mountain Shaking Guide, saying that those who practiced this fist stance were like pillars standing between heaven and earth. Heaven and earth would be forced to churn and rotate following the movement of their fists. It was no wonder that the barefoot old man in the bamboo building in Downtrodden Mountain had called the Mountain Shaking Guide useless apart from its boastful and ambitious nature after casually flipping through it. Chen Ping'an gently slapped the ground with one hand before gracefully flipping around and performing a handstand with a single palm on the bamboo ground. Pei Qian turned around, and she really wanted to laugh when she saw this scene. With his body upside down, Chen Ping'an used his free hand to point at the lake, gesturing for Pei Qian to focus on fishing. Pei Qian obediently turned around, and Chen Ping'an changed his palm into a fist, using just a single fist and a single finger to stand upside down. He stretched his body straight, and he channeled his true qi using the Heaven and Earth stance of the Mountain Shaking Guide. None of this proved difficult for him. Chen Ping'an closed his eyes. Apart from using a single finger on one hand to support himself, he held the index finger and middle finger of his other hand together in front of him. He was on the verge of overcoming the barrier between the 12th and 13th stops of the 18 stops technique that Aoyang had taught him. Chen Ping'an originally had no need to rush, but now things were different. He had taught Pei Qian the 18 stops technique in the dust medicinal shop in Old Dragon City, and Pei Qian had been quite happy about earning 2 or 3 copper coins after leaving Wasptail Ferry Station. Afterward, she had told Chen Ping'an that she could freely channel 12 stops already, and she had said that in a tone that clearly showed disappointment in how slowly it was going. Chen Ping'an had felt slightly helpless after hearing this, and he had no option but to warn Pei Qian against becoming too conceited and hasty. She needed to take things one step at a time. It was inevitable that Chen Ping'an felt slightly anxious. More precisely, he was worried about how things would develop. If Pei Qian continued to climb the ranks of martial Dao at such an astonishing speed, there would eventually come a day when this mischievous opening disciple of Chen Ping'an's reached the same height as her master. She would pull further and further ahead afterward, and she would climb higher by herself and ultimately peer down at the world. Disciples didn't have to be inferior to their masters, and in fact it was best if they could surpass their masters at some point. This was what Chen Ping'an had personally told Zheng Dafeng. Furthermore, the notion of indigo being extracted from bluegrass but being darker than bluegrass was a classical argument mentioned in the scholarly sage's exhortation to learning. 1. Chen Ping'an wasn't worried about Pei Qian's martial Dao progressing higher and further than his, but he needed to worry about his role as her Dao mentor and Dao guardian. What if Pei Qian's great Dao veered off the correct path one day? What should he do then? Would he act like he had back in the Flood Dragon Trench where he had tossed a handful of snake gall pebbles to the young Flood Dragon and apathetically said, "If this transforms into negative karma, then I'll draw my sword and eliminate it with a single slash"? Could Chen Ping'an bring himself to do this? And even if he were such a cold-hearted person, it was entirely possible that Pei Qian's martial arts cultivation base would be far too lofty for him to reach at that time. That being the case, how could he eliminate the negative karma with a single slash? In the lotus flower-blessed land, the old Taoist priest from the East Sea had led him through countless mountains and rivers. He had once witnessed the friendship between a group of noble people in the imperial court as a spectator, and he had seen how they had gone from helping the common people and building the nation to losing their way and acting in debauchery in a period of merely 80 years. They had all regarded themselves as noble people, so how could they possibly be flawed in any way? If any one of them was criticized in the imperial court, the others would all step forward to defend him and angrily criticize their political opponents in a righteous tone, whether they were right or wrong. They would all console their so-called noble friend, farewelling him under the willows, drinking wine to alleviate the stresses of life, and lamenting that the human heart was becoming increasingly fallible and sinister, with wolves and beasts gaining control of the imperial court. The literati in the cultivation world had disciples specially responsible for manipulating discourse and launching baseless accusations against political opponents, or even rewriting history, based on unfounded speculations. Since Chen Ping'an was having thoughts about founding his own force, he would naturally have to prevent such depravity from taking place. If he couldn't even educate his opening disciple properly, then how could he dare to claim that his force wouldn't become the next parasol leaf sect in a few hundred years or 1,000 years? How could he dare to claim that he himself wouldn't become the next Du Mao? Reading and studying to learn etiquette, and practicing martial arts to temper the body. This was Chen Ping'an's original plan for Pei Qian. In normal circumstances, this would be analogous to learning how to crawl, walk, and run on your own 2 feet. Everything would be stable and fine. However, the problem was that Pei Qian's martial arts talent was far too immense, and her fortune was far too profound. If there came a day when she felt like the reasonings and principles in the book were nothing more than a hassle that Chen Ping'an was forcing upon her, and if she felt like speaking reason with others was far too annoying and uninteresting, then what would happen then? She would feel like she had learned fist techniques and had a saber and sword hanging by her waist, so she could act according to her wishes and abandon the principles of moral vigilance, self-restraint, and adhering to etiquette. Not long ago, Chen Ping'an had spent 50 lesser heat coins without so much as a frown, and this was simply in the hopes that the world would gain a kind-hearted golden core tier great demon in the future. However, if he raised a 9th or even 10th tier martial artist who only cared about selfish gains and cared nothing about right or wrong, then to say nothing of 50 lesser heat coins, perhaps even 50,000 grain rain coins wouldn't be enough to rectify the situation. Still performing a handstand, Chen Ping'an pondered on these issues again and again with his eyes closed. However, he couldn't come up with a perfect solution no matter what. Did he truly have to sever Pei Qian's martial arts path with his own hands for the sake of that slim possibility in the future? When facing those vagrant cultivators who had harbored ill intentions yet hadn't caused a tragic disaster yet back in the mountain pass, Qian Pingyan had said that they could still speak reason with each other because the worst-case scenario hadn't come to pass yet. Otherwise, did Qian Pingyan need to deal with the situation in such a roundabout manner? He could have relied on his fists and blades to resolve the situation. Qian Pingyan had made the remark of "ask your own conscience" during the conflict in the border and back then. After the battle in Old Dragon City, and after learning of the unexpected events that had occurred later in the Parasol Leaf sect through Taoist nun Huang Ting, Qian Pingyan had made some changes to his way of thinking. Qian Pingyan felt like he should take a small step backward in certain situations. This small step would differ in size depending on the people and the location, and it was regarding this small step that he was contemplating many things. Otherwise, many problems would remain unsolved if he simply told people to act with a clear conscience all the time. Pei Qian was slightly angry about the fish not giving her face and taking her bait. However, she suddenly felt a slight pain on her cheek, and she realized that Sui Yubian was gesturing to her with her eyes. Following Sui Yubian's gaze, Pei Qian saw that Qian Pingyan's brow was furrowed into a deep frown as he remained standing on his hands. This was quite unusual for him. Sui Yubian retracted the finger that she had used to flick a bead of water onto Pei Qian's cheek. She continued to gaze into the distance. Pei Qian gently placed her fishing rod on the ground and quietly snuck over to Qian Pingyan's side. She squatted down and looked at her master's furrowed brow. Perhaps her master was a bit slow in coming to his senses, so he was only just starting to feel heartache for wasting those 50 lesser heat coins. Qian Pingyan opened his eyes and looked at the tanned face of the skinny little girl who was often exposed to the sun and wind, and had yet to become any paler. He smiled and asked, "What's wrong?" Pei Qian thought for a moment before replying. "Is there something on your mind, master? Why don't you tell me about it?" Qian Pingyan pushed lightly with his hand, flipping back around and returning to a normal standing position. He then sat down cross-legged, slightly hesitant about whether he should reveal his thoughts to Pei Qian. These matters were too far away, and the principles involved were also too profound. Was Pei Qian still too young for these things? Would his words and emotions be like a hefty rock weighing down on her shoulders? Qian Pingyan grabbed his sword nurturing gourd and drank a small sip of medicinal wine. A breeze that carried the scent of both mountains and water gently swept past Qian Pingyan's body, causing his mind to feel slightly more at ease. A lifespan of 100 years is very rare, yet being weighed down by worries enough for 1,000 years is very common. Qian Pingyan squinted his eyes after enjoying a sip of wine. He couldn't help but feel a sense of self-ridicule. Was he finally starting to become a little bit like a scholar now? He turned around and asked with a smile, "This matter is related to you, so do you want to hear about it?" Pei Qian gulped and immediately started to reflect on all her bad behavior during the journey. She was most likely aware that this wasn't a trivial matter that could be resolved with 1 or 2 flicks to the forehead. Thus she grimaced and asked, "Can I not listen? Can you tell me about these things when I grow older and become more mature?" Qian Pingyan patted her head and replied, "This doesn't pertain to anything good or bad. It's just some of my thoughts, and you don't need to worry about being flicked in the forehead or having your ears twisted." Pei Qian immediately sat up straight after receiving this reassurance from her master. She faced Qian Pingyan, who was sitting side on, and there was a smile on her face as she adjusted the bamboo sword and bamboo saber that were tied to the same hip. She feigned seriousness and said, "Please go ahead, master. Your disciple will listen with utmost respect." Qian Pingyan smiled and turned around slightly so that they were directly facing each other. He then asked, "If your saber skills, sword skills, and fist techniques become more powerful than your master one day, and if you come across a matter that your master says is correct, but you feel like is incorrect, what will you do then?" "I'll listen to you, master. What else can I do?" Pei Qian replied without hesitation. Qian Pingyan smiled faintly and said, "Give it some more thought." Pei Qian started to scratch her head, and she eventually replied with a frown, "But this is genuinely how I feel. If you say something is correct, then it definitely must be correct. If you say something is wrong, then it definitely must be wrong." Qian Pingyan offered no response to this. Pei Qian had no option but to aimlessly mull over this question again. Her mind wandered everywhere as if it were embarking on a long journey to distant places. In any case, it didn't look like her master was in a hurry to get an answer from her. Pei Qian suddenly smiled and asked, "Master, if I become stronger than you one day, just how strong will I become?" Let's take the parasol leaf sex Du Mao for example. Or as Huang Ting calls him, old criminal Du in other words, a cultivation base at the ascension tier. Qian Ping'an replied. He then smiled and added, let's focus on cultivation base only and disregard any notions of good and bad. Pei Qian gasped in astonishment and exclaimed, good heavens! I'll definitely have mountains of gold and silver at home if I'm that strong, won't I? Will I be able to count all of it? It will be far too tiring to count though. However, I'll be afraid of other people stealing a few coins if I don't count everything properly. Such is the worry of a wealthy person. When will I be able to worry like that? Qian Ping'an couldn't help but chuckle as he looked at the skinny little girl who was becoming increasingly worried about this problem. He leaned forward and gently patted her head, saying, there's a militarian sage in my hometown called Master Ruan. He's extremely skilled at blacksmithing and forging swords, and when I think back, there was something else that he genuinely did very well as well. When it came to taking new disciples, Master Ruan looked at more than just aptitude and talent. He also considered whether his disciples were like-minded people, and whether they could walk alongside each other on the path of the great Tao. He didn't look for disciples who were extremely talented yet had poor character, nor did he look for disciples who would mindlessly stand up for their master and fight other people no matter the situation. Pei Qian wanted to speak, yet she couldn't help but hesitate. In the end, she eventually decided against saying anything. Returning to my question from before, how should you respond if you enter an argument with your master? Qian Ping'an continued. You shouldn't feel like your master is always correct. Your master isn't a sage, and he also makes mistakes. We should do what we're doing right now. We'll sit opposite each other and list out the reasons why we think we're correct or incorrect, and we'll discuss these points and listen to the more reasonable person. I, Qian Ping'an, won't shut you down simply because I'm your master. If you, Pei Qian, become very powerful in the future, so powerful that you can kill me with a casual punch, you're not allowed to do as you please and ignore my reasoning either. Pei Qian's eyes brimmed with tears. She didn't understand this fully, but she couldn't help but feel was a very upsetting matter. This was especially the case when she heard Qian Ping'an say that she would become powerful enough to kill him with a casual punch. Pei Qian was almost about to die from sadness. She turned around in grief and secretly shed tears, not looking at her master, who was suddenly speaking nonsense. Qian Ping'an returned to his original spot and sat facing the lake that was rippling under the spring breeze. He extended a hand and raised it higher and higher, saying, in reality, reasons and principles are also separated into different levels of importance. This is similar to how I was drawing circles of different sizes atop the mountain before. I once encountered a young fox spirit in a rundown temple located in a place called the Colorful Garment Nation, and this young fox spirit was very fond of novels about talented scholars and beautiful ladies. The fox spirit was mischievous and liked to frighten people, yet it never truly harmed anyone. Rather, it helped them receive shelter from the wind and rain. This time we came across the yellow earth bull that would rather die than turn its body and affect innocent people. However, does this then imply that we can gloss over the courageous sacrifices of those sword cultivators, who have pointed their swords toward the south for tens of thousands of years, when considering the demon tribe's assault on the Sword Qi Great Wall? Should we pity the demon tribe and interrogate the sword cultivators as to why they're so ruthless? After all, are there no righteous and kind-hearted individuals in the demon tribe? With her back still facing Qian Ping'an, Pei Qian sniffed and replied through sobs, this I understand. These people aren't considering the sequential order of right and wrong, nor are they considering the different levels of importance of reasons and principles. Qian Ping'an quickly drew the largest circle before raising his hand high above his head and continuing, however, I feel like the scholarly sage and master Bai, the one rumored to have forged a large ding for the human tribe and illustrated the mountain scouring album, are the only people who have the right to talk about unalterable reasons and principles. We're extremely far away from reaching this level. So why then has the scholarly sage chosen to imprison himself in the forest of virtue, and why has Master Bai been imprisoned in the mighty suppressing pagoda? Should we abandon reason and feel like it's useless because of this? Is it truly the case that good deeds don't beget good karma, and bad deeds don't beget bad karma in the world? Pei Qian turned around and shuffled over to sit beside Qian Ping'an. She lowered her head and commented, but some bad people do indeed live better lives than good people. Qian Ping'an smiled and replied, And that's why the old monk in the Heart Manifestation Temple in the capital of the Southern Garden Nation said that this world has always been indebted to good people. Then what should we do? Pei Qian asked in a soft voice. Qian Ping'an didn't drink the medicinal wine in his sword-nurturing gourd. Instead, he retrieved a pot of osmanthus wine from his minimization treasure. He cracked open the pot and took a small sip, after which he smiled faintly and replied, "The answer is most likely waiting for us in the books." Lying on the ground in the distant mountain forest, the yellow earth bull mulled over these words. Even though Sui Yubian's expression was indifferent, she had also been listening to the conversation between Qian Ping'an and Pei Qian the entire time. Pei Qian wiped her tears and chuckled. "Master, when you were cooking rice not long after we left Wasptail Ferry Station, how did that tune from your hometown that you were humming go again? Why did it have no lyrics? Can you hum it again? I really want to learn it." Qian Ping'an smiled and replied, "My best friend taught me this tune, and the lyrics of this tune can be changed however people want. Back in my hometown, people use this tune to tease or scold people, they used it to relax themselves when working, and they also used it to accompany wine." Qian Ping'an drank a sip of osmanthus wine and started to quietly hum the tune. He then pointed at Pei Qian and sang, "Waiter over there, I've read some books and learned some characters. I've accumulated a belly full of knowledge that can't sell for many coins of copper." He was singing about Pei Qian. Pei Qian was overjoyed and she couldn't help but instinctively sing, "Stinky tofu is delicious, but I can't afford any." Qian Ping'an smiled knowingly and continued, "There are spirits in the mountains, there are ghosts in the rivers. I turn around in fright, only to discover that I've left home for many years. It's time to eat stinky tofu." Pei Qian chimed. Qian Ping'an drank another sip of wine and randomly pointed elsewhere. Unfortunately for him, it was coincidentally where Sui Yubian was sitting. However, he had no time to worry about this as he sang, "Young lady, where are you from? You smell like fragrant orchids, so why is your face filled with tears? Oh, isn't this pitiful?" Pei Qian nodded earnestly and sang, "She's unable to eat stinky tofu, so this is truly very pitiful." Qian Ping'an squinted his eyes and pointed up, softly humming, "May I ask, scholar, what shall we do? A small paper kite is hanging on the branches. The sun is scorching it too." Pei Qian clutched her belly and laughed loudly, singing, "It's time to eat stinky tofu. The stinky tofu is so fragrant." Inside the bamboo house, Zhang Shanfeng and Su Yuanxia looked at each other and smiled. Zhu Lian also closed his eyes and smiled, with his head bobbing back and forth. Lu Baixiang gently patted his knees to the tune. In an extremely rare display, Sui Yubian didn't get angry at Qian Ping'an's actions. Instead, she covered her mouth with a hand and smiled widely for once, squinting in the sun. Wei Xian rested his cheek in his hand and cocked his head. He had wandered over to the entrance of the bamboo house and squatted down at some unknown time. He looked at the skinny figure of the tanned little girl. With the beautiful mountains and limpid lake as their backdrop, the master and disciple performed a lively duet with each other. 20 days later, Qian Ping'an and the others walked past a lofty mountain that was as steep as the painted eyebrows of beautiful women. After entering this area, they surprisingly came across two groups of men and women on the small mountain path within just 15 minutes. One group had a dozen or so people radiating with auras of wealth and prosperity, most of them evidently family members of government officials. There were men, women, elderly people and children, and they were being protected by several guards armed with long sabers. The other group of people were clearly from the cultivation world. 4 of the 16 people were men in their 50s with calm breathing and silent movements, undoubtedly practicing top-notch martial arts techniques from the cultivation world of the Azure Phoenix Nation. The leader was an elder with an aquiline nose and an intense gaze, and walking beside him was a round-faced young girl. She didn't have a remarkable appearance overall, but her eyes were especially lively and beautiful. Both groups of people were climbing up the mountain, and Qian Ping'an actively walked over and asked about the local customs and traditions when coming across the first group of people that seemed to radiate prosperity. Only after hearing the explanations from these people did Qian Ping'an realize that Azure Waste Mountain, the mountain they were on, had a Taoist temple called Golden Osmanthus at the peak. There were immortals cultivating in this temple, yet it was often closed to the public for years on end. During winter last year, the temple asked some woodsmen to deliver a piece of news to the outside world. They were going to take in 9 disciples, and they wouldn't take into account these disciples' backgrounds as long as they were under 16 and possessed the necessary faith. As a result, no fewer than 300 people were now bringing young children from their clans and families to the Golden Osmanthus Temple to try their luck. An endless stream of people was funneling into Azure Waste Mountain. Chen Ping'an was still thinking about True Marshal and the short saber that his 2 friends had left in the chief military governor's office, so he wasn't too willing to become involved in this grand occasion. Zhang Shanfeng and Su Yuanxia had traversed many mountains and crossed many rivers during the past 2 years, and they had also witnessed the liberation rite of water and land in the Azure Phoenix Nation, and the heavenly worship ceremony in the Fortune Mountain Nation. Thus, they weren't especially interested in a Taoist temple opening its doors to recruit new disciples. As for whether the Taoist priests in the Golden Osmanthus Temple were genuine immortals or fraudsters, Chen Ping'an and the others couldn't care less. Generally speaking, Golden Core-tier Earth Immortals were already paramount beings in most ordinary nations in the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent. After all, casting one's gaze across the entire majestic world, one could scarcely see places like the Great Li Empire, where there were so many crouching tigers and hidden dragons. After the armored cavalry of the Great Li Empire marched to the territory slightly north of Lakeview Academy, the Great Li Empire's Imperial Song clan had essentially conquered half of the entire Eastern Treasured Vile Continent already. Apart from receiving official recognition from the Confucian Academy, there was also an ever-growing chorus of calls for the Great Li Empire to be recognized as the 10th major empire in the majestic world. When they encountered the second group of people, the round-faced girl had looked curious and astonished the entire time. There was a young man in white robes carrying a bamboo bookcase on his back and wearing a vermilion wine gourd by his waist, a tan little girl riding a yellow bull and equipped with a bamboo saber and a bamboo sword, a stunningly beautiful woman carrying a sword on her back, and also a young Taoist priest and a big bearded martial artist. Fortunately, the old man in black clearly wasn't a simple person, but rather an experienced individual from the martial arts world who was still willing to adhere to some traditional rules. He quickly stopped the round-faced young girl's brazen act of staring at Chen Ping'an and the others. Not only that, but he even nodded to Chen Ping'an in acknowledgement, most likely treating this as an apology for his granddaughter. Chen Ping'an cupped his fists and smiled in reply. When traveling through the cultivation world, there would be many chance encounters. The 2 parties should have brushed past each other and remained as strangers, yet the sudden arrival of a torrential downpour quickly brought them together again. A rare onset of wild wind and heavy rain caused the small mountain paths to become extremely muddy and difficult to navigate. The frigid spring wind was already cold enough to cut to one's core, and the roaring mountain wind was only worse as it howled past. The thundering rain was also incredibly cold, and Pei Qian was directly beaten into a daze by the pea-sized drops of rain. Her face was red and aching, and her lips quickly became pale and devoid of blood. Her entire body was shivering. Moreover, this was after Pei Qian had already been practicing martial arts for a while. If this were before Pei Qian had started practicing martial arts, then it was very likely that a short amount of time in this wind and rain would leave her bedridden for a very long time and perhaps forever. Chen Ping'an asked Zhu Lian to scout the surroundings first to see whether there was anywhere for them to shelter from the wind and rain. Like a nimble ape, the hunchbacked old man leaped and dashed through the trees and boulders. It wasn't long before he returned, and he informed Chen Ping'an that there was a large and naturally formed rock cave not far ahead. Moreover, there was already a group of people resting there and seeking warmth from a campfire. Chen Ping'an carried Pei Qian on his back and opened up the parasol leaf umbrella that he had brought out from the lotus flower-blessed land. In addition to this, he also retrieved a straw raincoat and wrapped it around Pei Qian, doing his best to prevent her from being lashed by the violent mountain wind and rain. Zhang Shanfeng could barely keep his eyes open as he walked beside Chen Ping'an, and he loudly warned him, "There's something strange about this rain." Chen Ping'an nodded in agreement and took out a yellow paper talisman made from relatively ordinary materials. It was none other than a Yang Energy Illumination Talisman, the lowest grade talisman from the authentic death-avoiding book. Chen Ping'an would use this talisman to clear the path whenever he came across rundown temples or unmarked burial grounds, because the Yang Energy Illumination Talisman could show him the concentration of Yin energy in a certain area. Chen Ping'an held the talisman between his index finger and middle finger and shook it slightly, causing it to immediately combust after he funneled his true qi into it. Fortunately, the Yang Energy Illumination Talisman didn't burn too quickly. In fact, it burned much more slowly than the time he had ventured into the city god temple of the colorful garment nation by himself. However, Qian Ping'an didn't extinguish the Yang Energy Illumination Talisman, maybe out of an abundance of caution, and he continued to walk forward with the talisman between his fingers, lest there be any other traps ahead of them. He had offended a golden core tier earth immortal during the conflict in the mountain pass, and he had potentially attracted the attention of the 20 or so vagrant cultivators as well. It was very possible that the vagrant cultivators were coveting his treasures. Thus he most definitely couldn't let his guard down. In addition to this, Qian Ping'an also asked the Yellow Earth Bull whether it was aware of any great demons acting as rulers of the mountains in this area. Even though the Earth Bull hadn't assumed human form, it could indeed speak in human tongue. It bobbed its head and replied, "In the 500 years that I've possessed intelligence, I've never heard of any mountain ghosts or spirits causing trouble in the Azure Phoenix Nation. Well, I don't know about the last 200 years, since I've been laying low at the mountain pass. However, I did come across a monk expounding Buddhist teachings in a temple 150 kilometers from here, around 300 years ago. There was a very mystical scene of osmanthus flowers falling from the sky like rain, and it was rumored that the golden osmanthus flowers that had covered the entire ground of the temple were from the osmanthus trees located on this azure waste mountain." Su Yuanxia raised his hand to prevent his bamboo hat from being blown away, and he said with a loud laugh, "Zhang Shanfeng and I visited that Buddhist temple a long time ago. The temple is very famous, so we naturally had to visit it. However, apart from those written works on the walls, we didn't notice anything too special. There were some ruins related to famous Buddhist stories, but all of them were marked as restricted areas and were closed off to the public. The two of us wandered around for half a day, and we did indeed come across a scene that I recorded in my travel journal. When evening arrived, we saw two little monks who were responsible for carrying the offering boxes around. Perhaps due to the lack of worshippers and outsiders, the two little monks stood on their tippy toes and rummaged through the offering box. After a while, the little monk who caught a piece of loose silver first laughed loudly and was allowed to walk in front when they carried the offering box on their shoulders. Zhang Shanfeng and I thought it was pretty funny. As it turned out, the two little monks needed to carry the offering box up a very long set of stairs. Because of this, the person walking in front would suffer much less than the person walking behind. Qian Ping'an didn't have a deep understanding of Buddhism, especially since Buddhism wasn't popular in the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent. In fact, it could be said that Buddhism was the least popular in the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent out of the 9 continents in the majestic world. It was only in the lotus flower-blessed land that Qian Ping'an had started to learn about Buddhism, because he often visited the Heart Manifestation Temple that neighbored Champion Scholar Alley. Even so, he was slightly puzzled as he asked, "Isn't it said that monks shouldn't touch money with their hands? How can there be any unalterable rules in the world?" Zhang Shanfeng replied with a chuckle, "We didn't waste our time in those temples after all. Your exchange there was filled with thought-provoking Qian comments," Su Yuanxia remarked in an amused voice. 1. The Yellow Earth Bull seldom spoke. It would only open its mouth to speak when asked questions by other people. It fell silent at this moment, yet it clearly remembered that the ancient Buddhist temple had been constructed at the foot of a mountain. The bull was already at the sea observation tier at the time, and it observed the temple from the mountain forest because it didn't dare to get too close to the human world, lest it frighten and disturb the mortal humans. It was even more afraid of drawing disgust and ire from immortal beings. As a result, the Earth Bull only saw the young monk in snow-white kasaya from very far away. The young monk was standing under some eaves with bells hanging from them, and he extended his hands and caused many golden osmanthus flowers to rain down from the sky and fall into his palms. Qian Ping'an, Zhang Shanfeng, and Su Yuanxia walked swiftly as they spoke, and Qian Ping'an placed the remaining half of the Yang Energy Illumination Talisman inside his sleeve. They arrived at the rock cave that Julien had found. It was a relatively large cave that appeared much like ancestral halls from small towns and villages. It was large enough to shelter 30 to 40 people. The Yang Energy Illumination Talisman had burned slowly the entire time, and the further they ventured from the small mountain path winding up the mountain, the more slowly the talisman burned. This downpour was filled with yin energy, and it was most probably caused by Qi refiners targeting the Grand Disciple recruiting ceremony of the Golden Osmanthus Temple. The first group of people who had arrived in the stone cave were all women. There were 7 or 8 of them, and the oldest were graying old women, while the youngest looked 13 or 14. Because of the heavy downpour, the veiled hats that they had used to hide their appearances had become an inconvenience instead. Thus, these veiled hats were placed beside their feet along with their umbrellas and core raincoats. They were now sitting around a fire to warm themselves up, and their eyes remained cold and aloof when they saw Qian Pingyan and the others. A few of them shuffled closer to the flames, and it was clear that they weren't terribly enthusiastic about interacting with Qian Pingyan and the others. Qian Pingyan couldn't help but turn around and glance at Zhu Lian. However, the hunchbacked old man simply looked at him with an honest smile. These women from the same force had most likely entered this cave during the early stages of the heavy downpour, and they had clearly collected dry branches very early on. The ravaging winds and torrential rain outside the rock cave were powerful enough to tear houses apart. Yet Qian Pingyan and the others could only stare at the flickering flames but not walk over. Even though Zhang Shanfeng's cultivation base wasn't high, he could still use some elementary mystical abilities to start a fire. This wasn't difficult for Qi refiners. However, carelessly using mystical abilities when traveling outside was a huge taboo for cultivators. Qian Pingyan helped Pei Qian erect a small tent, after which he opened his bamboo bookcase and took out a set of clean clothes for her. He asked Sui Yubian to help Pei Qian get changed. When Pei Qian hopped out of the small tent in a lively manner, the group of people from the cultivation world had also backtracked and entered the rock cave in a disheveled manner, seeking shelter from the violent wind and rain. In fact, the wind and rain were so violent that even gallant cultivators from the martial arts world had to lower their heads and bend their backs. Qian Pingyan nodded in greeting when he saw the old man with an aquiline nose, and the latter also nodded in reply when he saw this. Since Qian Pingyan was being so polite with these cultivators from the cultivation world, Zhu Lian and the others quietly shuffled aside to free up some space. The round-faced young girl was drenched, and she was surrounded by a group of subordinates to block the view of other people. Her clothes were soaking wet, after all, and this caused them to hug her body and reveal her curves. After they sat down, the round-faced young girl started to examine the group of women in the distance again. Her eyes lit up and she asked, "You women aren't from the lofty Sky Nation's Blusher Hall, are you?" The round-faced young girl had only stolen a few glances at Qian Pingyan and his companions before, yet the old man with an aquiline nose had already warned her to stop. This time, however, the old man closed his eyes and rested his mind even though the round-faced young girl was speaking in such a disrespectful manner that was bordering on provocation. He turned a blind eye to this. Sitting in the distance, a young woman with intense eyebrows turned around and scolded her in anger. "Insolence!" The round-faced young girl was completely unafraid, and she smiled widely and countered, "May I ask, how am I being insolent?" These women of varying ages had come from Blusher Hall, a top-notch cultivation force in the lofty Sky Nation. The youngest girl looked 13 or so, had a slender face and was very beautiful. She widened her eyes and curiously looked at the young girl who was the same age as her yet dared to speak in such an impudent manner. Few people in the cultivation world of the lofty Sky Nation dared to provoke Blusher Hall, so these people were most likely from a powerful force in the Azure Phoenix Nation or the Fortune Mountain Nation. The young girl with a slender face instinctively extended a thumb and caressed the characters inscribed on an exquisite paper-cutting knife hanging by her waist. The yellowing bamboo sheath had a soft and pleasant luster, and the 2 characters miniature one were inscribed in the bamboo. The young woman who had scolded the round-faced young girl just then had a pair of sabers on her hips, and she placed her hands on their hilts, an ice-cold expression on her face as she replied in a solemn voice, "Then let's spar and see who's stronger?" 3. Forearm sparring was a relatively refined way of sparring in the martial arts world, and it was very rare for blood to be drawn in this type of sparring. This was because the loser shedding blood would imply that the victorious party had won unfairly. In other words, it would be a less than impressive victory. The round-faced young girl made a face at the young woman and accused, "You're picking on a junior relying on your old age and your decades of extra experience? That doesn't seem very heroic, does it?" The young woman was infuriated upon hearing this. She was yet to reach 30, so how could she possibly have decades of extra experience compared to the round-faced young girl? A graying old woman with a graceful and poised aura turned to the young woman and said in a soft voice, "Why argue with a junior? If one is unable to cultivate one's mind and control one's temper, then one's martial arts cultivation base will fail to reach lofty heights." The young woman clearly had immense respect for the old woman, so she immediately lowered her head and replied, "I'll keep this in mind." Sitting in the distance, the round-faced young girl chuckled and remarked, "It seems old grandma has much better manners." This was clearly a backhanded compliment. Looking on as an outsider, Chen Ping'an simply felt like the round-faced young girl was exceptionally skilled at using words to stab other people's hearts. The old woman paid no heed to the round-faced young girl's disrespectful remarks. She turned her gaze to the old man with an aquiline nose and asked, "Are you gang leader Zhu, the previous leader of the Great Marsh Gang?" The old man in black opened his eyes and replied with a smile, "It's already been close to 30 years since I last traveled outside, yet someone actually remembers my title still?" The old woman smiled faintly. The cultivation world will still remember the mighty name of gang leader Zhu, even if another 30 years pass. The expressions of the women from Blusher Hall changed slightly when they heard the old woman reveal the identity of her interlocutor. Zhu Fengxian, the demonic gang leader of the Great Marsh Gang, had a fearsome reputation in the cultivation world. 30 years ago, Zhu Fengxian liked to travel around the world in a bright red horse-drawn carriage. He had charged through the martial arts worlds of several nations and left nothing but bloodshed in his wake. Dozens if not hundreds of powerful cultivators had died at his hands. Zhu Fengxian also had 8 disciples, and they were known as the 8 underworld officials in the cultivation world. They possessed incredible might and a resounding reputation in the Azure Phoenix Nation. However, the Great Marsh Gang had suffered a huge disaster 30 years ago, and Zhu Fengxian had started to cultivate in seclusion while half of his 8 disciples had been killed. Initially, the gang had more than 5,000 people, but more than half of the members had eventually scattered and left. The Great Marsh Gang had once ruled over the cultivation world of the Azure Phoenix Nation. Yet for the past 30 years, they had slowly disappeared from view and fallen completely silent. Zhu Fengxian was just about to close his eyes and continue resting, yet the old woman who had appeared extremely poised and graceful the entire time suddenly added, "However, the present is different from the past. The cultivation world is far more powerful and complicated than 30 years ago. So it's best that people remain polite and refrain from boasting when they travel outside their own territories. It would do you well to kowtow more and speak less." The round-faced young girl suddenly widened her eyes in shock, feeling like she had just heard the most hilarious joke in the whole wide world. She stared intently at the graying old woman, trying to figure out if she had lost her mind. "If I remember correctly, Blusher Hall has always been a second-rate force in the lofty Sky Nation ever since its founding 200 years ago," Zhu Fengxian remarked in an apathetic voice. "Blusher Hall has been suppressed the entire time. What, perhaps someone has appeared on top of you women sometime during the past 30 years. Chen Ping'an could feel a headache forming. They were simply sheltering from the rain, so how had they managed to come across some mysterious hostility between 2 forces from the cultivation world? Not long ago, Pei Qian had still been complaining about the fact that they had only come across the yellow earth bull but no other spirits or ghosts after leaving Wasptail Ferry Station. Right now, Pei Qian was listening to the conversation between the 2 groups of cultivators very carefully. This was the cultivation world. She also had to enter the cultivation world in the future, so she needed to listen more and learn more right now. Julien quietly nodded to himself. There were many layers of meaning behind gang leader Zhu's words. "If I'm not mistaken, old gang leader Zhu, you want to take this young girl to the Golden Osmanthus Temple and have her cultivate immortal techniques there. But are you aware that the temple master of Golden Osmanthus is an old acquaintance of Blusher Hall?" The old woman revealed with an expression of ridicule. "Of the 9 disciples that they're taking, it's already been decided that one will be from Blusher Hall. Moreover, it was the old immortal who personally agreed to this. In other words, we're only climbing Azure Waste Mountain as a formality. If the sharp-tongued young girl sitting beside you genuinely possesses some cultivation aptitude and is fancied by the temple master, then she does indeed have a chance to call Qingcheng her senior sister." The young girl from Blusher Hall flushed slightly red in embarrassment. The round-faced young girl looked at her and giggled. "Oh, so your name is Morning?" "One. Well, my name is Night." Zhu Fengxian smiled faintly and replied, The temple master of the Golden Osmanthus Temple is a rare and genuine immortal, and it's because of this that I was willing to return to the cultivation world now that he's opening the doors of the temple to recruit 9 disciples. However, the Golden Osmanthus Temple isn't the only immortal force in the Azure Phoenix Nation. In other words, I can kill all of you first before bringing my granddaughter to some other immortal force. Of course, I could also leave and instruct the disciples of the Great Marsh Gang to guard your girl in secret. They'll surely teach her how to cultivate in peace. The old woman's expression became dark, and she said with a cold chuckle, "Bring her to some other immortal force? That's easy for you to say. Why did the old immortal from the Golden Osmanthus Temple set an age limit for the disciples? Are you not clear about this, Zhu Fengxian? If you delay things for 2 or 3 more years, then your granddaughter can forget about cultivating to become an immortal. Even if she's accepted into an immortal force thanks to the influence of the Great Marsh Gang, she'll probably become nothing more than a maidservant who can only serve other people. You should be aware that cultivating in immortal forces is a ruthless task, so do you need me to teach you about this principle again?" Even the expression of the round-faced young girl who looked deceptively innocent became cloudy. The old woman had no idea that she wasn't a pure martial artist, but a third-tier chi refiner. Even so, the round-faced young girl was aware that a delay of 2 to 3 years during her youth would indeed be extremely detrimental to her cultivation. When she advanced to the middle 5 tiers in the future, she might need to spend dozens of years to make up for this delay of 2 to 3 years during her youth. In the words of her grandpa Zhu Fengxian, and the military advisor from the Great Marsh Gang, she was a 1-in-100-year cultivation prodigy. Unfortunately, the Great Marsh Gang only had a single immortal scripture in their arsenal. Even though this immortal scripture was quite high grade, it could only help one advance to the middle 5 tiers. This immortal scripture was from some immortal force that had long since disappeared from the Azure Phoenix Nation, and it didn't explain how one could become an earth immortal who treated clouds as food and dew as drink and traveled tens of thousands of kilometers on the wind. This scripture was most likely for all internal disciples to cultivate, while the secret techniques passed down through the ancestral hall of the immortal force were only accessible to the direct disciples of the elders. Pei Qian listened on with relish as she squatted beside Chen Ping'an. She felt like these kinds of verbal arguments were the most interesting. In fact, this was even more interesting than the catfights between women that she had witnessed on the streets of the Southern Garden Nation's capital when she was little. Chen Ping'an couldn't help but feel slightly worried. Neither party was a pushover, so he was afraid that their war of words would eventually transform into a war of fists and blades. The cave was only so big, so there would be nowhere for them to hide from any stray attacks. Perhaps he should speak up and warn them now? Or perhaps he should tell the Great Marsh Gang and Blusher Hall to fight outside. Chen Ping'an sighed and stood up, directly walking between the two parties before arriving at the entrance of the rock cave. He grabbed the remaining half of the Yang Energy Illumination Talisman from his sleeve with 2 fingers, and a small flicker of golden yellow flame appeared on the talisman again, appearing like a swaying blade of grass in the gentle spring breeze even though it was being attacked by such ferocious wind and rain. The small flame calmly flickered on the talisman, and Chen Ping'an turned to the two parties in the rock cave and said with a smile, "There's something strange about this downpour, and an abnormal energy has remained strong right from the very beginning. It's very likely that this is being orchestrated by some sinister chi refiners hiding in the shadows. The immortals from the Golden Osmanthus Temple haven't come out to address the situation yet, so it's best to remain vigilant when you climb Azure Waste Mountain and head to the temple. Why not set aside your differences for now? The cultivation paths of the 2 young ladies are already within reach, and this is naturally the topmost priority for both of you right now. Climbing this mountain is essentially setting foot on the path of cultivation." Chen Ping'an glanced at the 2 young girls before continuing. "Why burn bridges and make your cultivation paths narrower? If you dislike each other, you can turn around and go your separate ways. The path of the Great Tao is wide enough, after all." Zhu Fengxian nodded and concurred with a smile. "You are indeed correct. I hope you'll have an opportunity to visit my Great Marsh Gang in the future, and I'll definitely welcome you with a grand banquet." Even though he was only being polite, these were polite words personally uttered by old demon Zhu Fengxian after all. At the very least, they would carry quite some weight in the cultivation world of the Azure Phoenix Nation. The old woman glanced at the yellow paper talisman in Chen Ping'an's hand before smiling faintly and saying, Qingcheng will definitely remember your words of wisdom, young master. Qingcheng smiled beautifully at Qian Ping'an. The yang energy illumination talisman between Qian Ping'an's fingers was completely burnt out, and the flickering golden flame also disappeared for good. Qian Ping'an rubbed his fingers together and said with a chuckle, "Someone once said that when traveling through the cultivation world, powerful martial artists shouldn't use their fists too rashly. And after becoming a powerful immortal, one shouldn't unleash their mystical techniques too recklessly." The round-faced young girl smiled and asked, "Dare I ask, young master, which paramount being spoke these words?" "A friend of mine," Qian Ping'an replied. The round-faced young girl who had jokingly called herself Knight raised a thumb and clicked her tongue in wonder, remarking, "Good one." Meanwhile, the young girl called Qingcheng was slightly curious about Qian Ping'an's identity. Zhu Fengxian and the old woman from Blusher Hall exchanged a glance. They were both experienced individuals from the cultivation world, so there was no need to speak to communicate their thoughts. The trivial argument between them was nothing compared to the cultivation paths of their descendants and juniors. Even if they disliked each other, it was indeed important for them to avoid conflict before they successfully climbed the mountain and entered the Golden Osmanthus Temple. In fact, the Great Marsh Gang and Blusher Hall might even have to work with each other if they encountered dangers along the way. They would need to overcome the challenges together. Qian Ping'an turned around and looked outside. Rain was still thundering down without any signs of relenting. What season was it in the lotus flower-blessed land right now? Who had entered the ranks of the upper 10 elites? Of course, Imperial Preceptor Zhongqiu, Lake Mountain Factions Yu Zhani, and Bird's Eye View Peaks Lu Feng were definitely members of this elite group. Were there brand new door gods and couplets plastered on the gates of that residence in the small alley? Qian Ping'an heaved a soft sigh. Having taken the bamboo bookcase off his back, Qian Ping'an was now carrying nothing but Sword Immortal, the pseudo-celestial tool that Old Dragon City's Fu clan had given him as compensation through Fan Juanmao's hands. Qian Ping'an raised his head, looking up at the pitch-black curtain of rain. Back when he was still young and naive, he remembered that a person wearing a bamboo hat and holding the reins of a donkey had boasted that he could draw and resheath his blade so quickly that no splashing water could enter the scabbard, even if it were bucketing down rain. Now, however, even Qian Ping'an could achieve this. In any case, when could he become a genuine sword immortal? Right now, Qian Ping'an found it very difficult to even draw Sword Immortal from its scabbard. Upon thinking of this, Qian Ping'an grabbed his sword nurturing gourd and took a large swig of wine. However, he forgot that it wasn't ordinary osmanthus wine or well-water immortal wine in his sword nurturing gourd, but instead medicinal wine from Fan Junmao. Qian Ping'an immediately shivered, and his face turned bright red. He broke into a fit of coughing, and he had no option but to cover his mouth and turn around, feeling slightly apologetic as he walked back to Pei Qian in irritation. His immortal demeanor collapsed in a flash. White Water Temple was located to the south of the central region of the Azure Phoenix Nation, and inside the temple was a spring bubbling from the ground, with each drop of water looking like a rolling pearl. This spring water was the best water for brewing tea, and it was because of this that many scholars and literati from the Lofty Sky Nation and the Fortune Mountain Nation would especially travel to White Water Temple to enjoy some tea brewed from the spring water. As a result, it was quite understandable why White Water Temple had so many worshippers visiting and offering incense. This also caused it to become equally as renowned as the North Mountain Temple located in the capital. Compared to how active the eminent monks from the North Mountain Temple were in the imperial court of the Azure Phoenix Nation, however, it seemed like the monks from White Water Temple weren't especially fond of being highly visible in public. Moreover, no extraordinary Chan master of note had appeared in White Water Temple during the past 100 or so years. As a result, there were inevitably accusations that the current monks in White Water Temple were living off the achievements of their predecessors. Due to these reasons, the North Mountain Temple was enjoying the greatest amount of attention now that the extremely grand debate between Buddhism and Taoism was just around the corner. On the other hand, it was quite surprising that not a single monk from White Water Temple that had a rich history of over 1,000 years, had stepped forward and volunteered to participate in the grand event that would determine the ranking of the three teachings in the Azure Phoenix Nation. Spring rain had continued to fall recently, and the myriad of temples in the Azure Phoenix Nation were all shrouded in hazy mist and rain. On this evening, A young monk dressed in snow-white kasaya slowly walked around inside White Water Temple. White Water Temple had remained shut for close to 1 month already, and this was quite a troublesome experience for those sincere Buddhist worshippers. The young monk in white kasaya looked calm and pure-hearted, and both the old monks and young monks in White Water Temple looked over and greeted him when he walked past. However, the young monk dressed in the eye-catching white kasaya paid no heed to their greetings. Everyone was already accustomed to this. The young monk arrived near the railing of a small pond with dark green water, and this pond had the magnificent title of Dragon Pool even though it looked quite unremarkable. This was due to a rumor that an old softshell turtle was living in the small yet extremely deep pond. This softshell turtle had been released here by some monks during the construction of White Water Temple, and it would only swim to the surface and show itself to the world when monks expounded on profound and mystical Buddhist philosophies when giving lectures. Even the official history books of the Azure Phoenix Nation had records of this, so it was naturally the case that no one doubted its veracity. The young monk in white kasaya continued to casually stroll around the temple. He walked along a long corridor behind the main hall, climbing the steps and ascending higher and higher. There were many exquisite bells hanging under the eaves, and numerous spirits that were born from these bells and resided within them all flew out at this moment, flapping their transparent wings and pushing the bells back and forth. The young monk in white kasaya seemed to dislike these chiming sounds, instead preferring the ordinarily peaceful and tranquil atmosphere of the ancient temple. He furrowed his brows slightly. The small and nimble spirits immediately flew back into the bells hanging under the eaves. The young monk turned around and peered down at the small square located behind the main hall. That was the place where an eminent monk had once expounded Buddhism and celestial maidens had rained down flowers. He remembered that many golden osmanthus flowers had fallen from the sky that day, and the lecturing monk and the listening monks had all ended up sitting in many layers of osmanthus flowers. However, the lecturing monk had been slightly unaccustomed to the fragrance of the osmanthus flowers, and this had even caused him to sneeze several times. The listening monks had paid close attention to this, and some of them had even been able to ruminate on it and derive deep meaning. Afterward, they had inscribed their enlightenments on a stone tablet in White Water Temple. After walking up the stairs and reaching the top, the young monk in white kasaya walked around the scripture library and arrived next to the temple master's living quarters. There was a yellow mud wall measuring half a person tall here, and it marked out a small piece of land that had a well, a stone table, and a stone stool. The young monk pushed open the bamboo door and made his way over to the well, one which had already been sealed for many years. An extremely renowned Buddhist event had taken place here in the past, and it was said that even those in the Middle-earth Divine Continent had heard about this before. In fact, this was the main reason why White Water Temple still remained standing even though it hadn't produced an eminent monk for the past 100 years. White Water Temple had argued about this Buddhist event for several hundred years. Numerous large temples in the Azure Phoenix Nation had argued about it for many years. Different branches of Buddhism argued about it, and generation after generation of literati who believed in Buddha and studied Buddhism also argued about it relentlessly. The scripture library in White Mountain Nation was extremely impressive, and its collection of solitary copies and complete copies of scriptures was unrivaled in the Azure Phoenix Nation. However, the young monk in white kasaya standing in a daze beside the well detested this place the most. He had never set foot inside the scripture library, not even once. To stray one character from the scriptures was to entertain the teachings of the devil. To do so was to desecrate the teachings of Buddha. The young monk in white kasaya sat on top of the sealed well that was much like a round stool now. There was one thing that he had never understood in all these years. There was a passage in the Buddhist scriptures that talked about an arhat who was bound to become a Buddha in the future being threatened by a heavenly demon. Terror had gripped the arhat's heart, and he had sought out Buddha who had then given him a proper Buddhist scripture. This had allowed the arhat to defeat the heavenly demon. The young monk in white kasaya hadn't thought about this passage too much when reading it for the first time. However, he had suddenly come to a frightening realization one day, and this had caused him to descend into endless pain. There was an obsessive thought in his mind. Why am I, a measly monk from a small temple, confident that I won't lose my composure so badly if I encounter a heavenly demon? Yet, an arhat who was a pupil of Buddha and destined to become a Buddha himself in the future was so terrified and unsettled by the heavenly demon? How was the arhat's reaction any different from mortal humans who haven't studied Buddhism before? Where was his enlightenment and root of wisdom? Where was his Buddhist knowledge? Where were the Buddhist principles taught by Buddha? If such an arhat becomes a Buddha in the future, then just how profound and lofty can his teachings be? The young monk in white kasaya couldn't find an answer to his questions no matter how hard he thought about it. Tears streamed down his face as he sat on the sealed well. This young monk who had suddenly gained enlightenment during his youth could vaguely remember what the past him had done here many years ago. He had killed a cat and hacked it into two before tossing it into the well. A long time had now passed. Yet the young monk still remained a person who seldom spoke. However, he was extremely diligent when it came to doing physical labor in White Water Temple, resulting in his hands and feet being filled with calluses. He would also suffer frostbite every winter, causing his hands to split and become filled with blood. He slapped the sealed well again and again, seemingly unaware of the wounds on his palm that gradually became bloody and mangled. The young monk burst into tears as he continued to ferociously slap the sealed well, and his voice was hoarse as he murmured, "Wrong, you people are wrong again. Buddhist teachings exist right within it. I was also wrong. Chan principles can't be spoken, and to verbalize them is to make a mistake. However, isn't remaining silent also a mistake? All of us are wrong. But how can we avoid being wrong?" There was abnormal energy and a murderous aura contained within the heavy downpour, and Chan Ping'an had revealed this to the others with a few simple words. But what proved critical in having the Great Marsh Gang and Blusher Hall stop their trivial argument wasn't Chan Ping'an persuading them against burning bridges and making their cultivation paths narrower, nor was it the Yang energy illumination talisman that he had used. Instead, it was his remark that the immortals from the Golden Osmanthus Temple hadn't come out to address the situation yet. This implied that the Golden Osmanthus Temple was either planning first and making a move later, purposely appearing weak to draw their enemies out, or the Taoists there were genuinely weaker than their enemies and could only hide in the temple to avoid any conflict. No matter which of these two situations was true, the women from the lofty Sky Nation's Blusher Hall were unwilling to become involved in a fight between immortals and potentially sacrifice themselves, even if they were acquainted with the old immortal from the Golden Osmanthus Temple. As for old demon Zhu Fengxian, who had once caused bloodshed in the cultivation worlds of several nations, he was even more experienced and prudent. He was climbing Azure Waste Mountain in the hopes of building a relationship with the temple for the sake of his granddaughter's cultivation. The Taoist temple would also gain a prized disciple, so this was simply a case of both parties satisfying their own needs. The Great Marsh Gang would never bow its head to other people, and Zhu Fengxian naturally wasn't willing to become a lackey for the Golden Osmanthus Temple. Chan Ping'an returned to his original spot, and Pei Qian appeared like an obsequious lackey as she brought a small stone slab from some unknown place and offered it to Chan Ping'an as a small stool. She squatted on the ground and furiously cleaned the dirt from the stone slab as she looked up and consoled. "It's okay, master, you still appeared very elegant and refined. There were only some slight blemishes during the endgame, but these blemishes can be ignored and treated as negligible." Pei Qian had learned the concept of endgame from constantly watching games of Go between Liu Baixiang and other people. In fact, Pei Qian had learned many things through her constant interaction with the four martial artists from the Lotus Flower-blessed land. For example, she had learned about military formations from Old Man Wei, who had claimed that there was no such thing as single-line formations or Dragon Gate formations on the battlefield. Rather, formation simply came down to organizing the ranks and making sure that the vertical lines and horizontal lines were adhered to. In the end, it was down to each person's own ability to kill their enemies amid the chaos. Pei Qian had also learned some rules about musical instruments and Go from Little Bai, and she had learned how to cook a few wine-accompanying dishes from Zhu Lian. Seeing that Pei Qian always helped and was relatively hardworking, Zhu Lian had rewarded her with a novel about wandering martial artists in the cultivation world. Pei Qian was engrossed by this novel, so much so that she almost forgot to eat and sleep. In addition to this, she had also learned many code phrases pertaining to the cultivation world from Sui Yubian. For example, "This road is mine and these trees were planted by me. If you want to pass, then pay up." There was also "Impudent bandit, you dare to block my path and rob me? Eat my spear," and so on. Zhang Shanfeng glanced at the thick curtain of rain outside, and he felt slightly anxious as he said in a quiet voice, "This downpour filled with yin energy has been going on for such a long time already. Even chi refiners at the sea observation tier might not be able to sustain it for such a long time. Of course, this is unless they set up a rain summoning formation. However, if this downpour is genuinely caused by a formation rather than the mystical abilities of chi refiners, then the amount of money required is so exorbitant that they may as well scatter snowflake coins from the sky. In other words, it's more likely that this is being orchestrated by a chi refiner at the Dragon Gate tier. I wonder what cultivation bases the Taoist priests from the Golden Osmanthus Temple have? Can they deal with this yin rain that's affecting the fortune of this area?" The old woman hesitated for a moment before nodding and replying, "It's said that Temple Master Zhonggua is 200 years old, and he is at the Dragon Gate tier, allowing him to command wind and rain like those flood dragons in the clouds." Zhu Fengxian frowned and asked, "A rumor has caused a huge stir in the cultivation world recently. They say Zhonggua cultivated in seclusion for several decades, and when he came out, he had already become a legendary terrestrial immortal. Is this not the case?" The old woman smiled bitterly and replied, "Just how paramount and transcendent will one become after forming a golden core and becoming an earth immortal? Will they still need to recruit disciples? They can simply focus on cultivation and pursue the great Tao. Old gang leader Zhu, if you became an earth immortal, would you still be willing to pick up money from a small and muddy pond? Even if there's genuine gold and silver, things that people from the cultivation world value and would bend down to collect. Would immortals from the mountains care about these things? Of course, it's actually true that Temple Master Zhonggua has the potential to become an earth immortal. You don't need to doubt that, it's only a matter of time. Your granddaughter will definitely have a bright future if she becomes a disciple of Temple Master Zhonggua and cultivates in the Golden Osmanthus Temple." Zhu Fengxian nodded in understanding, with his expression also becoming slightly more amiable. As a 7th-tier martial artist, Zhu Fengxian would feel slight apprehension toward chi refiners at the Dragon Gate tier. However, he wouldn't exactly fear them. Several abode tier and sea observation tier chi refiners had already died at his hands. However, Zhu Fengxian was willing to show respect toward a Dragon Gate tier Taoist priest, who had the potential to become a golden core tier earth immortal in the future. Such a person naturally had the competence to be his granddaughter's Tao mentor. The Great Marsh Gang would definitely instruct someone to secretly travel to Azure Waste Mountain's Golden Osmanthus Temple to give them some offerings of silver every year. Zhang Shanfeng sighed in his mind. Those outside the mountains naturally didn't understand those from the mountains. Old gang leader Zhu Fengxian and the old woman from Blusher Hall both had very idealistic impressions of immortals from the mountains, viewing them as paramount beings who didn't defile themselves with impure mortal matters. However, what was so special about Golden Core tier Earth immortals? They also needed to work diligently to accumulate wealth. After all, there was nothing quite like cultivation when it came to spending money. Of course, with the exception of vagrant cultivators who were accustomed to being alone, most Earth immortals who owned a mountain or a cave abode wouldn't need to concern themselves with trivial mortal matters. They would naturally have subordinates to deal with these things, and they simply needed to focus on cultivation. In this sense, the old woman from Blusher Hall was half correct with her guess. At this moment, thunder and lightning suddenly boomed through the depths of the mountain covered by the curtain of rain in the distance, causing the earth to tremble and the wind and rain to change directions. One after another, several deafening howls tore through the mountain. It was as if a lion were roaring in rage. However, this peculiar phenomenon only lasted for a brief moment. Once again, there was only the sound of howling wind and lashing rain between heaven and earth. Approximately 15 minutes later, Sui Yubian Zhu Lian and Zhu Fengxian looked up and peered outside the cave at almost exactly the same time. Zhu Fengxian's expression remained unchanged, yet he couldn't help but immediately tense up. Among the young esteemed immortals group of subordinates, two of them had intuition no less sharp than his. One had to realize that Zhu Fengxian was one of the 4 superior grandmasters of the Azure Phoenix Nation, Fortune Mountain Nation, and Lofty Sky Nation. His fight with an immortal 30 years ago had damaged the foundation of his martial Tao, and he was still yet to return to his peak even after recuperating for 30 years. This resulted in him becoming the weakest of the 4 superior grandmasters. But a sickly tiger was still a tiger, after all, and Zhu Fengxian was far from being in dire straits. He had simply gone from second to fourth, and to everyone else besides the three people above, he was a paramount existence. With grand events pertaining to Buddhism and Taoism being hosted in this region 3 years in a row, it was indeed the case that many cultivators had been drawn out from their hiding. But how many top-notch ones could there be among them? There were indeed some so-called lesser grandmasters, but these people were nothing more than weak 7th-tier martial artists with unstable cultivation bases. In a real battle, these people would barely be able to take a few punches from Zhu Fengxian and the other superior grandmasters. So how had so many powerful elites appeared at once in this chance encounter in the mountains? Apart from the stunningly beautiful woman with a sword on her back and the seemingly amiable old man with a hunched back, there was also the dignified and imposing man with a saber as well as that taciturn but powerful-looking man. These two were clearly extremely capable elites from the cultivation world as well. This was the only reason Zhu Fengxian had been impressed by Qian Ping right from the very beginning. Clouds only yielded to dragons and wind only submitted to tigers, so if the young esteemed immortal wasn't strong enough, how could he have possibly won over such grandmasters? The thundering rain gradually subsided. Walking through the pouring rain, several young Taoist priests from the Golden Osmanthus Temple arrived outside the stone cave. The leader of the group was a priest with a jade-like face and a mesmerizing smile. Apart from their own umbrellas, the priests standing behind him were also carrying a bundle of oil paper umbrellas in their arms. Only the Taoist priest standing in front didn't have anything else in his hands, appearing especially graceful and dignified as he closed his umbrella and walked inside the stone cave. However, his aura was different from that of ordinary young masters from wealthy clans. The Taoist priest looked at the people inside the cave and said with a faint smile, "There are sinister people causing trouble and attempting to ruin the fortune of the Golden Osmanthus Temple. But there's no need to panic. The temple master and 2 of his good friends from afar have already retracted their mystical abilities. You can rest assured and ascend the mountain with me. The sinister people have already been caught and punished, and not a single one of them managed to escape." The old woman from Blusher Hall stole a glance at Qingcheng, unable to suppress the excitement in her eyes. When hearing the deafening thunder and lightning just then, the old woman had already been speculating in hope and feeling extremely moved. Blusher Hall had high hopes for Qingcheng, and it was extremely unlikely that any further accidents would occur once she managed to become a disciple of the Golden Osmanthus Temple. Hearing the handsome Taoist priest confirm that 2 good friends of the temple master had come from afar to help, the old woman couldn't help but feel mixed emotions upon recalling the immortal portrait cherished by the old ancestor of Blusher Hall. Before passing away, the old ancestor had still asked the young her and another senior sister of hers to hold the 2 sides of the picture scroll and unfurl it, allowing her to gaze upon the appearance of that man one final time. It was because that immortal man had instructed someone to deliver a message to Blusher Hall that they were going to such great lengths to guard Qingcheng and bring her to the Golden Osmanthus Temple to cultivate. 100 or so years had passed, and this was the first time that he had actively made contact with Blusher Hall. Thus, everyone in Blusher Hall had been absolutely delighted. The handsome Taoist priest who looked ethereal and transcendent smiled and continued, "The canopies of these umbrellas are normal oil paper, but the shafts are special. They're made of osmanthus branches infused with spiritual energy by seniors in the temple. These umbrellas can block demonic wind and murderous rain, so you don't need to worry about being attacked by sinister energy, even if you are crossing mountains and rivers, or walking through graveyards at night by yourselves. Entities will naturally retreat and flee far away when they come across these umbrellas. The temple master was worried that there would be family members among your forces who have never practiced martial arts, so he especially asked me to come down the mountain to hand you these umbrellas." He gave away a dozen or so oil paper umbrellas. A little Taoist priest with full lips and sparkling teeth noticed Pei Qian straight away, as she seemed to be the same age as him. When the handsome Taoist priest instructed them to give the umbrellas out, he immediately ran toward the tanned little girl, giving her an umbrella with a wide smile. Pei Qian didn't care for these crappy umbrellas from the Golden Osmanthus Taoist Temple, but she couldn't turn it down in a rude manner because Qian Ping was standing right next to her. She needed to abide by the rules set by her master. Thus, she politely declined the little Taoist priest's offer before earnestly thanking him for asking. The little Taoist priest was slightly worried. And he said that one shouldn't underestimate the rain filled with yin energy. This was especially the case for people with frail bodies and fragile fortunes, as being drenched by this rain would very likely leave them with deep-rooted illnesses. At that time, even medicine wouldn't be able to cure them. Moreover, the temple was lending them these umbrellas for free, so there was no reason not to accept them and use them. In any case, these oil paper umbrellas with osmanthus branch shafts weren't heavy at all. Pei Qian was supremely annoyed at the fact that she couldn't roll her eyes. Chen Ping'an couldn't help but chuckle as he looked at the adorable little Taoist priest, explaining the dangers of this downpour to Pei Qian with a serious expression. He patted Pei Qian's head and told her to accept the oil paper umbrella. He then looked at the handsome Taoist priest and asked, "Senior Taoist priest, I've heard that your esteemed temple is opening its doors to recruit disciples right now. My companions and I have arrived here by chance, so would we be able to visit the temple atop the mountain to witness this grand ceremony?" The handsome Taoist priest nodded and replied with a smile, "Of course you can visit and attend the ceremony. When you reach the top of Azure Waste Mountain, you simply need to collect a small booklet, and keep in mind the rules and taboos detailed inside it." The little Taoist priest immediately turned to the handsome Taoist priest and shouted, "Junior uncle, I've already memorized everything in the booklet. Maybe I can explain it to this young master instead." The handsome Taoist priest smiled faintly and replied, "Then you can accompany this young master up the mountain if he's willing to listen to your explanations." Chen Ping'an cupped his fists, smiled and said, "Thank you, senior Taoist priest, and thank you in advance, little Taoist priest." Chen Ping'an turned around and looked at Su Yuanxia and Zhang Shanfeng, and both of them nodded lightly in response, signaling that it was fine to climb the mountain and enter the Taoist temple.